Ladies and gentlemen, before I continue reading Mr. Harrington's final wishes,
The room had never been this quiet. Not during the company's biggest victories, not during its darkest financial crises, not even when thousands of employees waited to learn whether they would still have jobs after another difficult year. Yet on this cold morning, beneath polished wood, white flowers, and rows of grieving faces, silence settled over every person inside the funeral chapel. Executives who had spent decades making billion-dollar decisions lowered their eyes. Attorneys sat with thick folders resting on their laps. Board members whispered to one another before falling quiet again. Family members filled the front rows, while hundreds of employees stood shoulder to shoulder near the back, many unable to hide their tears. At the center of it all stood a man everyone believed had already earned the right to carry the company forward. For 15 years, he had been the first to arrive each morning and often the last to leave at night. He had rescued failing contracts, comforted frightened workers, negotiated impossible deals, and protected a family business through moments that should have destroyed it. Everyone inside that chapel assumed they already knew how the story would end. They believed the founder's trusted son-in-law would leave the funeral carrying not only his grief, but also the responsibility of leading the empire he had spent nearly half his life protecting. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Because what happened next would leave everyone questioning whether loyalty alone is ever enough to secure a place in the legacy you helped create. Then the attorney slowly rose from his chair, holding a thick leather folder that looked ordinary enough to contain routine legal papers. Nobody paid much attention at first, because everyone believed this was simply the formal confirmation of what they had expected for years. The founder had trusted only one man with every difficult decision. That man had negotiated with banks when creditors demanded immediate payment. He had reassured frightened employees during economic downturns. He had traveled across the country to reopen factories that others considered beyond saving. He had celebrated every milestone with the family, while quietly carrying responsibilities that few people even understood. Surely today's meeting was nothing more than a final formality before his next chapter officially began. But as the attorney adjusted his glasses and cleared his throat, an uneasy feeling settled over the room. The confidence that had filled the chapel only moments earlier slowly disappeared. Every face turned toward the front. Every whispered conversation stopped. Every eye focused on a single folder that suddenly seemed much heavier than leather and paper should ever feel. Without raising his voice, the attorney opened the documents and read one sentence that instantly erased 15 years of certainty. According to every legal document we have, Mr. Daniel Carter has never owned a single share of this company. No one moved. No one spoke. Even those who barely understood corporate law recognized that those words had just changed everything. For several endless seconds, nobody knew how to react. Some employees looked toward Daniel, expecting him to laugh and dismiss the statement as an obvious mistake. Others glanced at the founder's family, waiting for someone to interrupt the proceedings and explain that the attorney had opened the wrong folder. But no correction came. The silence only grew heavier as confusion spread through the chapel like a wave moving from one row to the next. Daniel himself never argued. He never demanded another explanation. He never accused anyone of betrayal. Instead, he simply stood there, his expression frozen somewhere between disbelief and heartbreak, as though every memory from the previous 15 years had suddenly become impossible to understand. Every late night at the office, every missed holiday with his own relatives, every difficult decision made to protect a company he believed would one day become part of his family's future. In that single moment, the foundation beneath his entire life seemed to disappear. If his name had never appeared on a single contract, ownership record, partnership agreement, or succession document, then what exactly had all those years been building toward? Had he misunderstood everything? Or had someone carefully ensured that his sacrifices would never be recognized when it mattered most? That question is what makes this story impossible to forget. How can a man dedicate 15 years to protecting someone else's dream, believing he is securing a future for his own family, only to discover at the very end that, on paper, he never officially belonged to any of it? Was this a heartbreaking misunderstanding created by misplaced trust? Was it the result of promises spoken privately, but never written legally? Or did someone quietly benefit from allowing Daniel to believe he had a future that never actually existed? The answers are hidden beneath years of decisions, conversations, family expectations, and business secrets that remained unnoticed until the one person capable of explaining them was no longer alive. As we uncover each piece of this remarkable true story, you'll discover that the greatest losses are not always measured in money, titles, or ownership. Sometimes they are measured by the painful realization that loyalty, hard work, and unconditional trust can become invisible if they are never protected by the simplest words written on a single sheet of paper. And by the time the full truth finally emerged, the damage had already reached far beyond one funeral, one family, or one company. The answer, as you are about to discover, is far more heartbreaking than anyone inside that chapel could ever have imagined. Daniel Carter was not the kind of man who entered a room demanding attention. He was the kind of man people noticed only after realizing that every difficult problem had somehow been solved while he stood quietly in the background. Raised in a small Midwestern town by a schoolteacher mother and a mechanic father, Daniel learned early that hard work was not something you talked about, it was something you simply did. He graduated near the top of his class, earned a degree in industrial engineering, and built a reputation as someone who could see solutions others missed. Colleagues often described him as unusually intelligent, but Daniel never cared much for praise. He drove an aging pickup truck long after he could have afforded something better, lived in a modest apartment, and sent money home whenever his parents needed help. There was nothing flashy about him. No expensive watches, no powerful connections, no family fortune waiting in the background. What he possessed instead was discipline, honesty, and a relentless work ethic that made people trust him almost immediately. The problem was that trust rarely impressed the kind of people who measured success by wealth. Those people belonged to the Harrington family. By the time Daniel first heard their name, Harrington Manufacturing had become one of the largest, privately owned manufacturing companies in America. The company produced industrial equipment used in factories, energy facilities, and transportation systems across the country. Its founder, Edward Harrington, had built the business from a single machine shop into a multi-billion-dollar empire that employed thousands of workers. Newspapers called him a self-made titan. Business magazines featured his photograph on their covers. Politicians sought his support, and competitors watched his every move. The Harrington family lived in a world that felt completely separate from Daniel's. They attended charity galas, traveled on private jets, and moved through circles where influence was treated like currency. To outsiders, they represented the American dream at its most powerful. To those inside the family, they represented something even more important: legacy. Edward Harrington had spent decades building an empire, and everyone assumed that empire would eventually pass to his only child, Emily Harrington. Emily was unlike the image many people had of wealthy heiresses. She was educated, sharp, and far more interested in business operations than social events. After graduating from an elite university, she joined the company and worked through multiple departments instead of immediately taking an executive title. Employees respected her because she asked questions that showed she actually understood the business. Yet despite her intelligence, she lived under constant scrutiny. Board members discussed her future. Family friends speculated about who she would marry. Investors quietly wondered whether she could one day lead the company her father had built. Edward Harrington protected her fiercely, but that protection came with expectations. The man who married Emily would not simply become part of a family, he would become connected to one of the most influential private companies in the country. That reality made her relationship with Daniel seem impossible from the very beginning. They met during a supply chain conference in Chicago. Daniel was there representing a mid-size engineering firm that specialized in factory efficiency systems. Emily attended on behalf of Harrington Manufacturing. During a panel discussion, a presenter proposed an expensive solution to a production problem that many companies were facing. Most attendees nodded politely. Daniel quietly raised his hand and explained why the proposal would fail within 6 months. He outlined a cheaper alternative, backed by data, and answered every question the panel threw at him. Emily was intrigued. After the session ended, she approached him expecting arrogance from someone who had just challenged industry experts in public. Instead, she found a man who seemed almost embarrassed by the attention. Their conversation lasted nearly an hour. They spoke about manufacturing, labor shortages, technology, and eventually about their families and backgrounds. Emily discovered that Daniel understood the industry as deeply as many executives twice his age. Daniel discovered that the woman standing in front of him cared more about solving problems than impressing people. They exchanged numbers, and what began as professional conversations slowly turned into something neither of them expected. When news of the relationship reached the Harrington family, the reaction was immediate. Relatives questioned Daniel's motives. Some assumed he was chasing money. Others argued that a man from a modest background could never understand the responsibilities that came with the Harrington name. Family friends introduced Emily to wealthy investors, attorneys, and executives, hoping she would lose interest in the quiet engineer from the Midwest. At dinners and social events, Daniel could feel the judgment before anyone spoke. He did not belong to their world. He lacked the pedigree, the connections, and the polished confidence that many of Emily's previous suitors had displayed. Even some company executives privately dismissed him as temporary. They believed Emily would eventually realize that marrying someone outside the elite business community was a mistake. Daniel never tried to defend himself. He simply continued treating Emily with the same respect and honesty that had drawn her to him in the first place. What none of them realized was that one person had begun paying very close attention. At a company charity event several months later, Daniel arrived expecting another evening of polite smiles and quiet disapproval. He helped move equipment before the guests arrived, spoke with employees instead of executives, and spent most of the night trying to avoid drawing attention to himself. Near the end of the event, a problem arose with a demonstration machine that was scheduled to be shown to several important clients. Engineers struggled to diagnose the issue, while senior managers grew increasingly anxious. Without making a scene, Daniel asked if he could take a look. Within minutes, he identified a faulty component and explained how to get the machine running again. The demonstration proceeded on time, and the clients never realized there had been a problem. As the crowd began to disperse, Daniel turned to leave. That was when he noticed an older man standing across the room, watching him with an expression that was difficult to read. Edward Harrington had seen the entire thing. For the first time since Daniel entered the Harrington family's world, the founder of the empire looked at him not as Emily's boyfriend, but as something else entirely. When most people looked at Edward Harrington, they saw a billionaire industrialist who had spent decades building one of America's most respected manufacturing companies. They saw a man who rarely smiled during board meetings, who demanded excellence from everyone around him, and who never tolerated excuses. But very few people understood the way Edward judged character. He had spent his entire life surrounded by polished resumes, expensive suits, and ambitious executives who knew exactly what to say when opportunity knocked. Experience had taught him that confidence was easy to display when business was thriving. Real character only appeared when pressure became unbearable. After watching Daniel solve the equipment failure without asking for recognition, Edward made a decision that nobody else noticed. Instead of asking Daniel directly whether he was worthy of joining the Harrington family, he would spend the coming months quietly discovering the answer for himself. It would not be one conversation or one interview. It would become a series of tests so subtle that Daniel would never realize they were happening. By the time those tests ended, Edward intended to know exactly what kind of man his daughter had chosen. The first assignment seemed almost insignificant. Edward called Daniel a few days after the charity event and asked whether he would be willing to visit one of the company's older manufacturing plants to offer an independent opinion on its production process. Daniel assumed Edward simply wanted technical advice from someone outside the organization. He drove nearly 4 hours on his own time without asking whether he would be compensated. He spent an entire weekend walking through noisy factory floors, speaking respectfully with machine operators, maintenance crews, and supervisors who had worked there for decades. Instead of criticizing the workers, Daniel discovered outdated systems that management had ignored for years. He prepared a detailed report explaining how small operational changes could improve productivity without eliminating jobs. When he presented his findings, he gave credit to the factory employees who had shared their experience instead of taking the praise for himself. Edward read every page without saying much, but privately he noticed something important. Daniel's first instinct had not been to impress executives. It had been to help the people whose livelihoods depended on the company every single day. The assignment slowly became more demanding. Edward invited Daniel to attend supplier negotiations, asking him to sit quietly and simply observe. Halfway through one meeting, Edward unexpectedly asked for Daniel's opinion in front of experienced executives who had spent years climbing the corporate ladder. Rather than trying to sound impressive, Daniel carefully explained both the risks and opportunities before suggesting a solution that protected the company's interests while preserving a long-standing relationship with the supplier. Weeks later, Edward asked Daniel to inspect another struggling facility several states away. Then came requests to review financial projections, evaluate equipment investments, and help resolve disputes between department managers. Every task seemed unrelated to the last, yet together they formed a pattern. Edward was quietly exposing Daniel to every corner of the business. Daniel accepted every request without complaint, often sacrificing weekends, holidays, and personal time with Emily. He never once asked why these responsibilities kept growing, or whether they would eventually lead to a formal position. As far as he was concerned, he was simply helping the father of the woman he loved whenever he was needed. Eventually, the meetings stretched long after normal business hours. Some evenings, Edward would call Daniel unexpectedly and ask him to stop by his office after everyone else had gone home. The massive headquarters that bustled with activity during the day became almost silent after dark. Cleaning crews moved quietly through empty hallways, while the lights from nearby factories glowed against the night sky. Sitting across a conference table covered with reports and financial statements, Edward asked questions that had little to do with engineering. What would Daniel do if a recession forced the company to reduce costs? How should loyal employees be treated during difficult times? Was protecting profits more important than protecting families? Daniel answered honestly, even when he knew Edward might disagree. Sometimes the conversations lasted until well past midnight. They spoke about leadership, responsibility, failure, and the heavy burden of making decisions that affected thousands of lives. Daniel left each meeting believing he had simply shared his opinions with a curious businessman. He never imagined that every answer was quietly shaping Edward's view of the future. Inside the Harrington family, however, an entirely different story was taking shape. Emily's relatives noticed how frequently Edward summoned Daniel to company events and private meetings, but they misunderstood what they were seeing. They assumed Edward was deliberately overwhelming Daniel with impossible tasks to prove that he was unworthy of marrying into the family. At holiday dinners, cousins joked that Daniel was being treated like an unpaid assistant rather than a future son-in-law. Some board members privately predicted that Edward would eventually grow tired of him and encourage Emily to end the relationship altogether. Even Emily began worrying that her father might simply be testing Daniel until he finally made a mistake. Daniel dismissed her concerns with his usual calm smile, insisting that Edward was only asking for occasional advice and that there was nothing to worry about. What neither of them knew was that Edward had already begun trusting Daniel with information that even some senior executives had never been allowed to see. Months turned into more than a year, and the quiet examinations never stopped. Every challenge Daniel faced revealed another part of his character. When projects succeeded, he praised the team instead of himself. When problems occurred, he accepted responsibility without shifting blame. He listened far more than he spoke, treated factory workers with the same respect he showed board members, and refused to exploit his relationship with Emily for personal gain. Edward had spent decades searching for executives who possessed that combination of humility, intelligence, and integrity. Yet he found it in the young engineer many people had dismissed as ordinary. One evening, after another exhausting meeting that stretched well beyond midnight, Edward closed the final report, looked directly at Daniel, and remained silent for several moments. The expression on his face was different from anything Daniel had seen before. Finally, Edward spoke words that would alter the course of both their lives forever. "Daniel," he said quietly, "if you're willing to trust me, I want you to leave your career behind, because I have something much bigger waiting for you." Edward Harrington's words lingered in Daniel's mind long after he left the headquarters that night. The drive home felt unusually quiet, not because there was nothing to think about, but because there was far too much. For years, Daniel had carefully built a career that many engineers would have considered a dream. He was respected by his colleagues, trusted by his clients, and steadily climbing toward executive leadership at one of the country's fastest-growing industrial consulting firms. His future appeared secure, promotions came regularly, recruiters called often, and his financial stability was finally beginning to reflect the years of sacrifice he had invested in his profession. Everything he had worked for was now within reach. Yet Edward's offer threatened to change all of it. It was not simply an invitation to join another company. It was an invitation to abandon the career he had spent years building and step into a business where nothing would be guaranteed. There was no written contract promising future ownership, no formal succession plan, no extraordinary salary designed to persuade him. There was only Edward's confidence and a handshake built entirely on trust. For most people, the answer would have been obvious. Turning away from a successful career for uncertainty would have seemed reckless. But Daniel had never been motivated by titles or prestige. He believed that meaningful work mattered more than impressive job descriptions. And he believed Edward was offering him an opportunity to build something that would outlast both of them. When Daniel shared the proposal with Emily, she understood the weight of the decision immediately. She knew her father rarely placed complete trust in anyone, and the fact that he had personally asked Daniel to join the company spoke volumes about how highly he regarded him. Even so, she never pressured Daniel toward either decision. She reminded him that leaving his career meant giving up years of progress and entering a business where expectations would be relentless. If things went wrong, there would be no comfortable path back to the life he had already built. Daniel listened carefully before quietly admitting what had been growing inside him ever since Edward made the offer. He wasn't afraid of hard work. He wasn't afraid of responsibility. What unsettled him was the possibility of wondering for the rest of his life what might have happened if he had walked away from an opportunity that came only once. A few days later, he sat across from the executives at his consulting firm and submitted his resignation. They were stunned. Some believed Harrington Manufacturing had offered him an enormous financial package. Others assumed he had negotiated an executive title behind closed doors. None of them knew that Daniel was voluntarily accepting a position that paid considerably less than the one he was leaving behind. To Daniel, money had never been the reason for accepting Edward's invitation. He believed he was investing in a future rather than collecting a paycheck. His first months inside Harrington Manufacturing were nothing like many people expected. Instead of receiving a luxurious office or an impressive executive title, Daniel was placed wherever the company needed him most. One week he worked alongside production supervisors inside aging factories. The next week he traveled across several states inspecting facilities that had struggled for years with declining efficiency. He attended meetings before sunrise, spent afternoons reviewing operational reports, and often remained in the office long after everyone else had gone home. 16-hour workdays quickly became normal. While others enjoyed weekends with their families, Daniel could usually be found walking factory floors, listening to employees explain problems that senior management had overlooked for years. He believed the best ideas rarely came from conference rooms. They came from the men and women who operated machines, repaired equipment, and kept production lines moving every single day. Without realizing it, Daniel began changing the company's culture simply by treating every employee with respect, regardless of position or title. The employees noticed long before the executives did. At first, they viewed Daniel as just another member of the Harrington family who would eventually disappear into a comfortable office. Instead, they watched him stand beside mechanics covered in grease, eat lunch in the employee cafeteria instead of the executive dining room, and ask questions with genuine curiosity instead of pretending to know every answer. When machinery failed, Daniel stayed until repairs were complete. When factories struggled to meet production targets, he remained on site until the problems were solved. Workers who had spent decades feeling ignored suddenly found someone willing to listen. Supervisors began requesting Daniel's involvement in difficult projects because they knew he would never ask others to do work he refused to do himself. Slowly, respect replaced skepticism. Employees stopped referring to him as the owner's future son-in-law and started calling him one of their own. For Daniel, earning that respect meant more than any impressive title could have offered. He believed leadership was never granted by a position. It was earned through consistency, humility, and service. Every long day seemed to reinforce that belief, and Edward quietly observed the growing admiration without interfering. Not everyone welcomed Daniel's rising reputation. Behind closed doors, resentment quietly spread throughout the Harrington family. Some relatives questioned why Edward seemed to rely on Daniel's judgment more frequently than that of executives who had spent decades inside the company. Others viewed his growing influence as a direct threat to their own future inheritance. Family dinners became increasingly uncomfortable as conversations paused whenever Daniel entered the room. Cousins exchanged knowing glances. Uncles dismissed his ideas before hearing them. Even distant relatives who barely knew him spoke confidently about his intentions, convinced he had carefully positioned himself to gain control of the Harrington fortune. Daniel remained unaware of most of the criticism because he rarely paid attention to gossip. He continued arriving before sunrise and leaving long after sunset, believing that hard work would eventually silence every doubt. But envy has a way of surviving even the strongest evidence. The more employees respected Daniel, the more certain members of the family feared him. One evening, after another successful project had been completed ahead of schedule, two relatives lingered outside the boardroom as Daniel disappeared down the hallway. One looked toward the other and quietly whispered the words that would echo through the years to come. "It doesn't matter how hard he works," he said with quiet certainty. "He'll never truly belong here." The years passed so gradually that almost no one inside Harrington Manufacturing noticed how completely Daniel had become the foundation beneath the company. One project became another. One difficult quarter turned into another challenging year. The calendar kept changing while Daniel remained exactly where everyone expected him to be, arriving before sunrise with a cup of black coffee in one hand and a folder full of reports in the other. New employees assumed he had always been there. Veteran workers could barely remember how the company functioned before he arrived. His fingerprints were everywhere, though his name was almost nowhere. He redesigned inefficient production systems, strengthened relationships with longtime suppliers, introduced practical improvements that saved millions of dollars, and helped modernize factories that many competitors believed were too outdated to survive. Yet whenever someone congratulated him for another successful initiative, Daniel redirected the praise toward his colleagues. He believed companies were built by teams, not individuals, and that philosophy earned him something far more valuable than applause. It earned him the quiet trust of thousands of employees who knew he would never ask them to sacrifice more than he was willing to sacrifice himself. Over time, Daniel stopped thinking of Harrington Manufacturing as the company he worked for. In his heart, it had become the family legacy he was helping protect. Success, however, rarely travels without hardship following closely behind. Several years after Daniel joined the company, economic uncertainty swept across the country, shaking industries that had once appeared untouchable. Orders slowed. Long-standing customers postponed major contracts. Banks tightened lending requirements, and financial analysts openly questioned whether manufacturers dependent on heavy industry could survive another prolonged downturn. Inside the executive boardroom, anxiety replaced confidence. Every decision carried enormous consequences, because every mistake could cost hundreds of people their livelihoods. Daniel spent countless nights reviewing budgets, negotiating payment schedules with suppliers, and identifying ways to reduce expenses without destroying the workforce that had taken decades to build. While some executives argued that massive layoffs were the quickest solution, Daniel insisted there had to be another way. He proposed temporary reductions in executive bonuses, voluntary retirement incentives, and operational improvements that would save money without immediately sending families into financial uncertainty. The discussions were difficult, emotions often ran high, and there were moments when compromise seemed impossible. Yet Daniel refused to give up searching for solutions. He understood that behind every employee identification number was a real family depending on a steady paycheck, and that thought kept him working long after everyone else had gone home. Just as the company regained its footing, another crisis arrived without warning. One cold winter evening, a fire broke out inside one of Harrington Manufacturing's oldest production facilities. Flames spread rapidly through sections of the building before firefighters finally brought them under control. By sunrise, millions of dollars in equipment had been destroyed, production had stopped completely, and hundreds of employees stood outside wondering whether they still had jobs. Daniel reached the site before many emergency responders had even completed their reports. Instead of standing with executives at a safe distance, he walked through the damaged facility alongside engineers and safety inspectors, carefully planning how operations could resume without compromising anyone's safety. For weeks, he coordinated recovery efforts, negotiated emergency production agreements with partner facilities, and personally met with frightened employees to assure them the company had not abandoned them. His determination prevented customers from canceling major contracts that would have taken years to recover. Many workers later admitted they stayed with Harrington Manufacturing because they trusted Daniel more than any announcement coming from corporate headquarters. Edward watched every decision quietly, saying little in public, but privately he knew the company had survived because one man refused to accept defeat. The hardest years, however, had not yet arrived. When the COVID pandemic spread across the world, businesses everywhere found themselves facing challenges unlike anything they had experienced before. Factories shut down almost overnight. Supply chains collapsed as materials became increasingly difficult to obtain. International shipments were delayed for weeks or even months. Skilled employees became ill, and uncertainty touched nearly every household connected to the company. Harrington Manufacturing faced impossible choices every single day. Orders continued arriving while essential components failed to reach production lines. Customers demanded answers that nobody could honestly provide. Daniel transformed an empty conference room into a temporary command center where teams worked around the clock coordinating suppliers across multiple countries, identifying alternative sources for critical materials, and reorganizing production schedules almost daily. He spent countless hours speaking directly with employees, reassuring them that their health mattered more than quarterly profits, while searching relentlessly for ways to keep as many people employed as possible. There were painful layoffs that neither Daniel nor Edward could completely avoid, and every conversation weighed heavily on him because he knew each decision affected real lives. Still, through determination, careful planning, and extraordinary teamwork, the company endured one of the most difficult periods in its history. More than once, senior executives quietly admitted that without Daniel's leadership, Harrington Manufacturing might never have recovered. As the years continued passing, Edward Harrington grew older, but his confidence in Daniel only became stronger. It was no longer unusual for him to praise Daniel during executive meetings, shareholder presentations, or family gatherings. Whenever difficult negotiations ended successfully or another crisis was overcome, Edward would place a hand on Daniel's shoulder and say words that everyone in the room eventually came to recognize. "One day this company will be yours." At first, those words surprised people. Later, they became almost expected. Employees smiled whenever they heard them because they believed no one deserved the responsibility more. Even some executives who had once doubted Daniel eventually accepted that he had earned Edward's complete trust. Daniel himself never asked when that day would come. He never requested contracts, ownership documents, or written guarantees because he believed Edward's word carried the same weight as any legal agreement. After all they had experienced together, why would he think otherwise? 15 years of unwavering loyalty had convinced him that actions mattered more than paperwork. Yet hidden beneath every promise was a detail so small that almost everyone overlooked it. Edward repeated those reassuring words countless times, but despite all the conversations, all the praise, and all the promises, he never once put any of it in writing. Success has a way of revealing sides of people that remain hidden when life is comfortable. As Harrington Manufacturing continued to recover from one crisis after another, the company's financial strength returned with remarkable speed. New contracts poured in from across the country, international partnerships expanded, and profits reached levels few analysts had predicted after the difficult years the business had endured. The Harrington family celebrated with lavish gatherings at their sprawling estate, where expensive cars lined the driveway, private chefs prepared elaborate dinners, and conversations often revolved around vacation homes, investment portfolios, and luxury purchases. From the outside, they appeared to be the picture of a successful American dynasty. But beneath the polished smiles and carefully rehearsed family photographs, something had quietly begun to change. The unity that Edward had worked so hard to preserve slowly gave way to competition. Brothers compared their influence inside the company. Sisters measured their importance by the attention they received at family functions. Cousins who had contributed very little to the business suddenly spoke as though they had personally built the empire from the ground up. The greater the company's success became, the more some relatives viewed it not as a responsibility to protect, but as a fortune waiting to be divided. Daniel noticed the changing atmosphere, but chose to believe it was nothing more than temporary tension that naturally accompanied a growing family business. The jealousy became easier to recognize with each passing year. Relatives who had once barely attended company meetings suddenly appeared whenever cameras or important clients were present. Some introduced themselves to visitors as key decision-makers despite having little involvement in the company's daily operations. Others quietly questioned why Edward continued relying so heavily on Daniel's judgment instead of allowing more family members to take leadership roles. Behind closed doors, conversations frequently turned toward inheritance, ownership, and future control of the business. Daniel's name surfaced more often than he realized, usually followed by uncomfortable silence whenever someone noticed another person listening nearby. A few relatives openly suggested that Edward had become too dependent on his son-in-law, while others hinted that Daniel's influence had grown beyond what was appropriate for someone who had married into the family rather than being born into it. Yet none of those concerns were ever expressed directly to Daniel. Instead, they remained hidden behind polite smiles, firm handshakes, and carefully chosen words that sounded friendly enough on the surface while carrying entirely different meanings underneath. Edward seemed unaware of these quiet conversations, or perhaps he believed they would disappear on their own. Either way, the resentment continued growing without anyone confronting it openly. Luxury slowly became another dividing line within the family. As profits increased, several relatives embraced increasingly extravagant lifestyles that reflected the company's financial success. New waterfront homes replaced already impressive residences. Luxury vehicles arrived every few months. Exclusive clubs, private vacations, expensive watches, and lavish celebrations became regular topics of conversation. Daniel never criticized anyone for enjoying the rewards of success, but he quietly continued living much as he always had. Although he could easily afford a more extravagant lifestyle, he and Emily preferred a comfortable home, practical vehicles, and simple family traditions that reminded them where they had come from. That difference did not go unnoticed. Some cousins began joking that Daniel behaved more like an employee than a member of the Harrington family. Others interpreted his modest lifestyle as proof that he lacked the confidence expected of someone who might one day lead the company. Ironically, while they enjoyed the wealth generated by Harrington Manufacturing, Daniel spent most of his time ensuring the business remained healthy enough to sustain that very lifestyle. Yet in their eyes, he was still someone whose role was to manage the company on behalf of the family rather than become part of its permanent legacy. Without ever saying the words directly, many of them had already convinced themselves that Daniel existed to serve the Harrington name, not to share it. Emily noticed the changes long before Daniel did because she understood her relatives better than anyone else. At family dinners, she saw conversations stop whenever she and Daniel approached a table. During company celebrations, she watched invitations quietly exclude Daniel from certain private discussions involving inheritance and long-term ownership. On more than one occasion, she observed relatives speaking to Daniel with the tone reserved for trusted employees rather than respected family members. They thanked him for his hard work, praised his loyalty, and complimented his leadership. Yet there was always an invisible line they refused to let him cross. Emily raised her concerns more than once, asking Daniel whether he sensed that people were beginning to treat him differently. Daniel smiled gently and dismissed her worries almost every time. He believed success often created misunderstandings within families and insisted that actions mattered far more than whispered conversations. Edward trusted him completely. The employees respected him, and the company continued moving forward. As far as Daniel was concerned, there was no reason to waste energy worrying about opinions that could not change the work he loved doing. Emily wanted to believe him, but something deep inside told her the atmosphere surrounding the family had changed in ways that could no longer be ignored. One evening, after another elegant family gathering had come to an end, Daniel stayed behind to help several employees clean up while the rest of the guests departed in luxury vehicles. As he carried boxes toward the service entrance, he unintentionally passed a hallway where two distant relatives were speaking quietly, unaware that anyone else remained in the house. Daniel never heard the entire conversation because someone called his name before he reached the doorway. He walked away without giving the voices another thought. But one sentence drifted faintly through the hallway before the door closed, and although he barely noticed it at the time, those words would later return with devastating clarity. "As long as he keeps believing he's part of this family," one voice said, "everything stays exactly the way it is." Daniel continued toward the loading area, completely unaware that the greatest threat to everything he had built was no longer coming from outside the company. It was growing quietly inside the very family he trusted more than anyone else. The warning signs did not arrive all at once. They appeared quietly, almost politely, hidden inside ordinary conversations that seemed too small to deserve much attention. Looking back years later, many people would point to those moments and wonder how they had all been overlooked. But that is often how life changes. Rarely through one dramatic event, but through dozens of subtle moments that seem harmless until the truth finally comes into view. Daniel remained consumed by the responsibilities of keeping Harrington Manufacturing moving forward. Every week brought another challenge requiring his attention. New contracts demanded careful negotiation, aging facilities needed modernization, and customers expected the same reliability that had made the company one of the most respected manufacturers in America. His schedule left very little room for anything else. While he focused on protecting the future of the business, questions about his own future quietly began surfacing around him. Unfortunately, those questions came from the very people whose job was to protect companies from uncertainty: lawyers, accountants, financial advisors. Each of them noticed something that Daniel never considered important. None of them realized they were looking at the beginning of a tragedy that could have been prevented with a single signature. The first conversation happened after an annual corporate review attended by senior executives, outside legal counsel, and financial consultants. As the meeting ended and people gathered their files, one of the company's longtime attorneys approached Daniel in the hallway. He was an experienced corporate lawyer who had spent decades helping businesses navigate mergers, ownership structures, and succession planning. Speaking carefully, he asked Daniel whether they could schedule a private meeting sometime during the following week. Daniel assumed it concerned one of the company's expansion projects and immediately agreed, but before they could settle on a date, another executive interrupted them with an urgent production issue that required Daniel's immediate attention. The conversation ended almost as quickly as it had begun. Several days passed before the attorney reached out again, politely suggesting they discuss a few important personal matters regarding Daniel's long-term position within the company. Once again, Daniel apologized, explaining that another unexpected business crisis demanded his attention. He promised they would meet soon. The lawyer smiled, wished him well, and quietly walked away. He never imagined that opportunity would never come again. Around the same time, subtle questions began emerging from the accounting department. During routine financial reviews, senior accountants occasionally asked Daniel whether he had ever considered formalizing his executive responsibilities. One accountant casually mentioned that many leaders in similar positions typically held equity interests or documented ownership arrangements, especially after dedicating so many years to a privately owned company. Another wondered whether Daniel had reviewed the latest succession planning documents that were being updated for tax and estate purposes. Daniel listened politely but rarely gave the questions much thought. He assumed Edward and the company's legal team had already addressed everything necessary behind the scenes. After all, Edward had repeatedly spoken about Daniel's future in front of executives, employees, and even family members. Why would anyone publicly promise him the company if the legal details had not already been handled? Daniel believed actions carried greater meaning than paperwork, and Edward's actions over the previous 15 years had never given him reason to doubt that belief. The accountants exchanged quiet glances whenever Daniel left the room. They respected him deeply, but professional experience had taught them that assumptions and legal documents were rarely the same thing. As months continued passing, more people cautiously raised similar concerns. A financial advisor suggested reviewing estate planning to ensure everyone's expectations matched the official records. An outside consultant recommended documenting leadership responsibilities to prevent confusion during future transitions. Even one retired executive, who had watched Daniel devote years of his life to Harrington Manufacturing, gently advised him to make sure everything Edward had promised existed on paper as well as in conversation. None of these people accused Edward of dishonesty. In fact, most of them believed Edward genuinely intended Daniel to inherit a significant role within the company. Their concerns centered on something much simpler. Good intentions were not legally binding. Businesses worth billions of dollars could not rely on verbal promises alone, no matter how sincere those promises appeared. Yet every time someone cautiously encouraged Daniel to protect himself, he responded with the same calm confidence that had guided him throughout his career. He smiled, thanked them for their concern, and quietly said, "I trust my father-in-law." Those 5 words ended every conversation. They reflected not only his confidence in Edward, but also the kind of man Daniel had always been. He believed trust, once earned, should never require constant verification. To Daniel, those conversations felt almost disrespectful. Asking Edward for written guarantees seemed unnecessary, even insulting. Edward had treated him like a son, entrusted him with decisions affecting thousands of employees, and repeatedly declared before witnesses that one day the company would belong to him. Daniel saw no reason to question a man who had never given him cause to doubt his integrity. Emily occasionally revisited the subject after hearing similar concerns from professionals connected to the company, but Daniel gently reassured her each time. "Your father has never broken his word," he would say. "He's spent 15 years proving exactly who he is. I won't insult him by asking for paperwork." Emily wanted to believe those words because they reflected the same faith she had always placed in her father. Yet an uneasy feeling continued growing inside her, one she struggled to explain even to herself. Meanwhile, the lawyers stopped requesting meetings. The accountants stopped asking questions. The advisors quietly returned to their own responsibilities. One by one, they accepted that Daniel had made his choice. And although no one could yet explain why, an uncomfortable feeling began settling over everyone paying close attention. It was as though they were watching a man walk confidently toward a destination they could already see, while he remained completely unaware that the bridge beneath his feet had never actually been built. The years that followed would later be remembered as the golden era of Harrington manufacturing. What had once been a respected American manufacturer quietly transformed into one of the most successful privately owned industrial companies in the nation. Revenue climbed higher year after year, surpassing even the most optimistic projections prepared by financial analysts. Long waiting lists formed for the company's specialized equipment as customers praised its reliability and innovation. New production facilities opened across several states, each one larger and more advanced than the last. Warehouses that had once struggled to meet demand suddenly operated around the clock. Hiring announcements replaced layoff notices, and communities celebrated whenever Harrington Manufacturing announced another expansion, because everyone knew it meant hundreds of new jobs and renewed economic opportunity. Business magazines described the company's growth as remarkable. Competitors tried to imitate its operational model, but rarely achieved the same results. Investors quietly wondered how a family-owned business had managed to outperform corporations many times its size. The public saw the success. Very few people understood who was actually responsible for making it happen. Behind nearly every major decision stood Daniel Carter. Although Edward Harrington remained the public face of the company, those closest to the business knew that Daniel had become the person responsible for turning ambitious ideas into measurable results. He redesigned manufacturing systems that reduced waste without sacrificing quality. He negotiated long-term supplier agreements that stabilized costs during uncertain economic conditions. He encouraged investment in modern production technology years before competitors recognized its importance, allowing Harrington Manufacturing to increase efficiency while maintaining the craftsmanship that had built its reputation. When executives debated whether to expand into new markets, Daniel spent months studying economic trends, transportation networks, labor availability, and customer demand before presenting carefully researched recommendations. His plans rarely relied on luck. They were built on patience, preparation, and a willingness to listen to people working at every level of the organization. Employees admired him because he never claimed to have all the answers. Instead, he surrounded himself with capable people, encouraged honest discussion, and accepted responsibility whenever decisions carried unexpected consequences. Without realizing it, thousands of employees had begun viewing Daniel as the company's true operational leader, even if his official title suggested otherwise. The company's ambitions soon stretched far beyond American borders. International manufacturers sought partnerships with Harrington Manufacturing after hearing about its reputation for reliability and innovation. Delegations from Europe, Asia, and South America visited headquarters to explore opportunities that would have seemed unimaginable only a decade earlier. Daniel found himself spending weeks at a time traveling between countries, meeting government officials, factory owners, and logistics specialists while negotiating contracts worth hundreds of millions of dollars. He endured exhausting schedules, countless flights across multiple time zones, and endless hours inside conference rooms where every detail could determine the success or failure of a major agreement. More than once, negotiations appeared ready to collapse before Daniel calmly proposed solutions that satisfied every party involved. Those international partnerships dramatically increased the company's global presence and opened markets that competitors had struggled unsuccessfully to enter for years. Newspapers praised Edward Harrington's remarkable leadership, crediting him with transforming a regional manufacturer into a global industrial powerhouse. Edward always accepted the compliments graciously, yet whenever reporters stopped recording or guests left the room, he quietly acknowledged to Daniel that none of it would have happened without his vision and determination. "You built this," Edward would often say with genuine pride. "I simply had the privilege of watching it happen." Inside the company, Daniel's influence became impossible to ignore. Department managers sought his guidance before making major operational decisions. Factory supervisors trusted him enough to share problems they might have hidden from other executives. New employees quickly learned that if Daniel visited their facility, he would spend more time listening than speaking. He remembered names, celebrated promotions, attended retirement ceremonies, and never considered any task beneath him if it helped the company succeed. During particularly demanding periods, it was not unusual to find him walking production lines before sunrise and reviewing strategic reports long after midnight. His office light often remained on long after the rest of headquarters had gone dark. Yet despite carrying responsibilities equal to those of a chief executive, Daniel never requested additional authority or public recognition. He believed the company's success mattered far more than personal credit. That humility only strengthened the respect people felt toward him. To thousands of employees, Daniel had become the heart of Harrington Manufacturing. Edward remained its respected founder, but Daniel had quietly become the architect responsible for shaping its future. There was, however, one detail that remained almost invisible beneath all the remarkable success. Every new factory required permits, financing agreements, construction contracts, and ownership records. Every international partnership generated legal documents, licensing agreements, and corporate filings. Every acquisition, expansion, investment, and property purchase produced mountains of paperwork reviewed by attorneys, accountants, banks, and government agencies. Daniel participated in nearly every significant decision, negotiated countless agreements, and oversaw projects worth extraordinary amounts of money. Yet whenever another stack of official documents reached the final stage requiring legal signatures, only one name consistently appeared as the owner, the principal authority, and the controlling interest behind Harrington Manufacturing. Edward Harrington. Daniel signed operational approvals when necessary. He approved budgets, supervised projects, and implemented strategies that transformed the business into a fortune. But the deeds belonged to Edward. The stock certificates belonged to Edward. The corporate ownership records belonged to Edward. The governing documents belonged to Edward. 15 years after joining the company, Daniel had become the man everyone depended upon, the leader employees trusted, and the strategist who built an industrial empire admired across the country. Yet hidden inside filing cabinets, bank vaults, and law offices across America, every piece of paper that truly mattered carried only one name: Edward Harrington. Success brought comfort to the Harrington family, but it also brought a question that no one wanted to ask out loud while Edward Harrington was still alive. He was growing older. Although his mind remained remarkably sharp and his determination never seemed to weaken, time was beginning to leave quiet reminders that even the strongest leaders could not escape forever. He occasionally paused to catch his breath after climbing long flights of stairs. He delegated more responsibilities than he once had. Annual medical appointments became slightly more frequent, though Edward dismissed every concern with the same reassuring smile he had worn for years. To Daniel, these changes simply meant it was time to shoulder even more responsibility so Edward could finally enjoy the rewards of everything he had built. But elsewhere inside the Harrington family, the conversations had begun changing. Relatives who had once spoken about vacations, luxury homes, and business expansion slowly shifted toward a different subject. They no longer asked what the company would accomplish next. They quietly began asking who would control it when Edward was no longer there. Those discussions rarely happened in public. They took place behind closed doors, after dinners had ended and guests had gone home, where whispers often carried far more weight than speeches delivered in boardrooms. At first, the conversation sounded harmless enough. One cousin casually wondered whether the board would appoint an interim chairman if something unexpected happened to Edward. An uncle questioned how ownership would be divided among family members under existing estate plans. Another relative insisted the company should always remain under direct Harrington bloodlines, regardless of who had contributed most to its success. Those remarks gradually became more frequent, and each discussion seemed to attract the same familiar faces. Daniel was never present. Sometimes the meetings occurred after family gatherings had officially ended. Other times they happened in private offices inside company headquarters long after normal business hours. Invitations quietly circulated among relatives, trusted advisors, and selected executives, yet Daniel's name never appeared. No one openly explained why. If anyone asked, they simply described the meetings as routine family matters that did not require his attendance. Daniel never questioned the arrangement because he believed every family deserved private conversations. He remained focused on expanding the business, assuming those discussions had little to do with him. He had no idea that his future was becoming the unspoken center of many of them. The tone of those private meetings slowly changed from curiosity to calculation. Family members who had contributed very little to Harrington Manufacturing suddenly expressed strong opinions about leadership succession, ownership percentages, and voting rights. Some argued that years of employment should never outweigh blood relationships. Others insisted that no matter how talented Daniel might be, the company represented generations of Harrington family history and should never pass into the hands of someone born outside that lineage. Old resentments resurfaced alongside new ambitions. Every compliment Edward had ever given Daniel was quietly re-examined. Every important responsibility entrusted to him became another reason for certain relatives to feel threatened. A few suggested creating stronger legal protections to ensure family control remained exactly where they believed it belonged. Those recommendations were presented as sensible business decisions, but beneath the polished language rested something far more personal. Daniel's growing influence had become impossible to ignore, and for some members of the family, preventing that influence from becoming permanent had quietly become a priority. Emily never intended to overhear any of it. One evening, after a family dinner at the Harrington estate, she returned inside to retrieve a folder she had accidentally left in her father's library. As she walked down the hallway, voices drifted from a nearby sitting room where the door had not been fully closed. She recognized several relatives immediately. Their conversation stopped her in her tracks because she heard Daniel's name spoken with a seriousness she had never heard before. One voice insisted that Edward had become too emotionally attached to his son-in-law. Another argued that verbal promises meant nothing if the legal structure remained unchanged. Then someone else responded with words that sent a chill through her. "As long as nothing changes on paper," the voice said calmly, "everything stays exactly where it belongs." A few quiet laughs followed before another relative added, "He can run the company all he wants, but running it doesn't make it his." Emily stood frozen in the hallway, barely breathing, afraid that even the slightest movement would reveal she had been listening. She waited until the conversation shifted before quietly turning around and leaving without the folder she had come to collect. That night, Emily barely slept. She replayed every sentence in her mind, searching for an explanation that would make the conversation seem less alarming than it had sounded. Part of her wanted to tell Daniel immediately. Another part feared she might create unnecessary conflict based on fragments of a discussion she had never fully heard. She trusted her father with all her heart and believed he intended to honor every promise he had ever made. Perhaps the relatives were simply expressing opinions that carried no real influence. Perhaps they misunderstood Edward's plans just as badly as everyone else. Daniel noticed that Emily seemed unusually quiet over the following days, but whenever he asked whether something was wrong, she smiled gently and insisted she was only tired from work. She convinced herself there would be time to speak later, after she understood more, after she found the right moment, after she could separate fear from fact. She had no way of knowing that silence, chosen out of love and uncertainty, would soon become one of the greatest regrets of her life. And somewhere inside the Harrington estate, behind another closed door, a conversation was already taking place that neither Daniel nor Emily would ever hear until it was far too late. For most of his life, Edward Harrington had carried himself with the quiet confidence of a man who believed determination could overcome almost anything. Employees often joked that he seemed to know every corner of every factory better than the people who worked there. Even in his 70s, he insisted on walking production floors instead of touring them from a golf cart, climbing staircases instead of taking elevators, and personally inspecting new equipment before anyone else approved it. He rarely complained about being tired, rarely admitted when he was in pain, and never allowed personal discomfort to interfere with the company's responsibilities. To those around him, Edward appeared almost unstoppable. But time has a way of humbling even the strongest people. It began with small changes that were easy to dismiss. He occasionally paused during long presentations to catch his breath. He canceled a few business trips, blaming the weather or an unusually busy schedule. Some mornings he arrived later than usual, explaining that he had simply slept poorly the night before. Daniel noticed the changes but respected Edward's privacy, believing that if something serious were happening, Edward would share it when he was ready. Deep down, however, Daniel could not ignore the growing feeling that the man who had spent decades carrying everyone else's burdens was beginning to carry one he could no longer hide. The medical appointments gradually became impossible to overlook. What started as routine checkups slowly turned into consultations with specialists, diagnostic tests, and follow-up visits that appeared more frequently on Edward's calendar than board meetings. His longtime assistant quietly rearranged business schedules around appointments that were never publicly discussed. On several occasions, executive meetings ended early because Edward needed to leave for what he casually described as another doctor's visit. When curious employees asked whether everything was all right, he smiled warmly and assured them it was nothing worth worrying about. Daniel wanted to believe those reassurances because they sounded exactly like the Edward he had always known, calm, confident, and unwilling to burden others with personal concerns. Still, there were moments when he caught Emily watching her father with worried eyes, moments when conversations suddenly stopped as soon as he entered a room, and moments when the Harrington family seemed unusually eager to change the subject whenever Edward's health came up. Daniel quietly offered to assume more responsibilities whenever necessary, hoping to ease some of the pressure. Edward accepted the help gratefully, but never explained the full extent of what doctors had begun telling him behind closed doors. Then came the first hospital stay. Officially, the family described it as a precaution after a series of routine examinations. Employees received a carefully worded statement thanking everyone for their concern, while emphasizing that Daniel visited the hospital every evening after leaving headquarters, often carrying reports that Edward insisted on reviewing despite repeated encouragement from doctors to rest. Their conversations rarely focused on illness. Instead, they discussed pending contracts, production schedules, expansion projects, and the future of Harrington manufacturing. Even lying in a hospital bed, Edward remained more concerned about the company than about himself. Nurses occasionally smiled as they watched the two men spread financial reports across a small table beside the window, debating business strategies, while medical equipment quietly monitored Edward's condition. Those evenings strengthened Daniel's admiration even further. He saw a man whose greatest fear was not death itself, but the possibility of leaving unfinished responsibilities behind. What Daniel did not realize was that Edward was becoming increasingly aware that time might be running shorter than anyone wanted to admit. As the months passed, their conversations became quieter and more personal. Late one evening, after another exhausting day at the hospital, Edward asked everyone else to leave the room so he could speak privately with Daniel. The monitors hummed softly while rain tapped gently against the window. For a long moment, neither man spoke. Finally, Edward looked directly at Daniel with an expression Daniel had rarely seen before, one that carried both gratitude and regret. He thanked Daniel for standing beside the family through every triumph and every crisis, for protecting the company as though it were his own, and for treating employees with a level of respect that had earned their loyalty. Then, in a calm voice filled with certainty, Edward reached for Daniel's hand and said, "No matter what happens to me, everything will be taken care of." Daniel nodded without hesitation, because those words sounded exactly like the promise Edward had repeated for years. They were comforting, familiar, and spoken with complete conviction. Daniel never asked what Edward meant. He assumed the legal arrangements had already been completed long ago. Why would a man who had kept every important promise throughout his life fail to keep the most important one of all? After that evening, Edward repeated those same reassuring words several more times. Sometimes he said them during quiet walks through company headquarters after returning from treatment. Sometimes he whispered them while reviewing reports from home instead of the office. Once he even said them in front of Emily, placing a reassuring hand on her shoulder before telling both of them not to worry about the future. "Everything will be taken care of," he insisted with the confidence of a man who believed the matter had already been settled. Daniel accepted those words exactly as they were intended. Emily wanted to ask questions but stopped herself each time, convinced her father would explain when the moment was right. Neither of them realized that Edward never described what had actually been done, who had been entrusted with carrying out his wishes, or whether those wishes had ever been transformed into legally binding documents. He offered certainty but never details. He gave reassurance but never explanation. And while Daniel continued building the future he believed Edward had promised him, the most important conversation of his life remained unfinished, hidden behind words that sounded comforting enough to silence every doubt until there was no longer anyone left who could explain what they truly meant. The final executive meeting began like dozens of others Daniel had attended over the previous 15 years. Yet something about that morning felt different in ways no one could quite explain. The conference room overlooking the headquarters campus was filled with familiar faces, senior executives, department directors, legal advisors, financial officers, and several longtime board members who had watched Harrington Manufacturing grow from a regional manufacturer into one of the largest privately owned companies in America. Usually, Edward Harrington entered those meetings with his unmistakable energy, carrying handwritten notes and asking questions before anyone had even taken their seats. This time, however, he arrived slowly, leaning ever so slightly on the polished conference table before sitting down. His voice remained steady, but the room immediately sensed that the man who had once commanded every discussion with endless determination was conserving his strength. Daniel quietly slid a folder toward him, containing updates on 3 major expansion projects scheduled for the following year. He expected another long day of strategic planning, investment decisions, and ambitious goals. Instead, Edward closed the folder without reading a single page. Looking around the room, he calmly announced that every future expansion project, every planned acquisition, and every large capital investment would be placed on indefinite hold until further notice. A silence settled over the executives. No one expected the decision, especially after years of unprecedented growth. Yet no one challenged him. They assumed Edward had reasons they simply did not yet understand. The announcement immediately changed the atmosphere inside the room. Department heads exchanged puzzled glances while financial officers quietly shuffled through reports that suddenly seemed irrelevant. Some executives believed Edward had received troubling economic forecasts. Others assumed his recent health concerns had convinced him to adopt a more cautious strategy. Daniel studied Edward carefully, hoping to find some clue in his expression. But Edward remained remarkably composed. He calmly explained that the company had already achieved extraordinary success and that preserving stability had become more important than pursuing aggressive expansion. It was not the answer Daniel expected, but it sounded reasonable enough given everything Edward had been facing. Daniel quickly shifted his attention toward adjusting budgets, delaying construction schedules, and reassuring project managers that the temporary pause did not reflect a lack of confidence in their work. As always, his instinct was to solve problems rather than question decisions. If Edward believed slowing the company's momentum was the right choice, Daniel trusted him completely. Over the years, that trust had become almost instinctive. It had guided every major decision Daniel had made since leaving his own successful career to stand beside the Harrington family. He never imagined that trust was quietly preventing him from asking the one question that mattered most. When the formal meeting concluded, most executives gathered their documents and returned to their offices, discussing revised forecasts and postponed construction plans. Daniel remained behind, expecting Edward would want to review operational details privately, as they had done countless times before. Instead, Edward thanked him for another successful quarter, told him to spend the rest of the afternoon with Emily, and assured him that everything else could wait until the following week. It was an unusually brief conversation, almost strangely affectionate, as though Edward wanted Daniel to leave without worrying about unfinished business. Daniel smiled, shook his father-in-law's hand, and headed toward the parking garage, believing the day had ended earlier than expected. What he never saw was the group of attorneys quietly entering Edward's office. Less than 30 minutes later, thick folders replaced financial reports on the conference table. Confidential files appeared from locked briefcases. The office door closed softly, shutting out the noise of the busy headquarters beyond. For the next several hours, Edward remained inside with legal advisors, accountants, and estate specialists, while documents were reviewed one after another. Pens moved steadily across page after page. Signatures were added where required. Witnesses initialed sections prepared weeks earlier. Outside the office, employees continued their work completely unaware that decisions affecting the future of the company were being finalized only a few steps away. Late that evening, Daniel returned to headquarters after realizing he had forgotten an operations file in his office. The executive floor was unusually quiet, with only a few lights still glowing behind closed doors. As he walked past Edward's office, he noticed several attorneys leaving with sealed document cases tucked beneath their arms. They greeted Daniel politely, exchanged a few pleasant words, and wished him a good evening before disappearing into the elevator. Daniel smiled to himself. The sight actually brought him comfort rather than concern. After months of medical appointments, hospital visits, and repeated assurances that everything would be taken care of, he assumed the legal team had finally completed the succession planning Edward had promised for years. In Daniel's mind, those mysterious meetings represented responsible preparation. Edward was ensuring the company would remain stable whenever the time came for leadership to change hands. Daniel never considered asking what documents had been signed or requesting to review them himself. He believed doing so would suggest he cared more about ownership than about Edward's health. His loyalty once again silenced every doubt. He quietly picked up his forgotten folder, turned off the light in his office, and drove home believing the future had finally been secured. What Daniel could not possibly know was that those documents contained almost everything necessary to protect the Harrington empire: estate instructions, financial arrangements, tax strategies, charitable commitments, and detailed corporate directives prepared by experienced legal professionals. They reflected decades of planning and extraordinary wealth accumulated over an entire lifetime. Yet buried within hundreds of pages was one extraordinary omission that no one outside that office would discover until after Edward's funeral. Daniel's name appeared only in passing references connected to operational responsibilities, never as an owner, never as a shareholder, never as the successor Edward had described so confidently for 15 years. The legal paperwork had addressed nearly every imaginable detail, but the promise that had shaped Daniel's entire adult life remained exactly where it had always been in Edward's spoken words and nowhere else. As Daniel drove home that evening with complete peace of mind, convinced the succession plans had finally been completed, the greatest misunderstanding of his life had already been signed, witnessed, filed away, and quietly locked inside a lawyer's vault. The morning of Edward Harrington's funeral arrived beneath a sky covered with heavy gray clouds that seemed to reflect the grief settling over everyone connected to Harrington Manufacturing. Long before the service was scheduled to begin, cars stretched for blocks outside the historic chapel where family, friends, employees, and business leaders gathered to say goodbye to the man who had spent more than 5 decades building not only a successful company, but also a community that had provided opportunities for thousands of American families. The entrance was lined with white lilies, deep green wreaths, and photographs capturing different seasons of Edward's remarkable life. One picture showed a young machinist standing proudly beside a single piece of equipment inside a modest workshop. Another displayed the ribbon-cutting ceremony for the company's first major factory. Others captured moments with employees, charity events, and company celebrations that had become part of Harrington Manufacturing's long history. There was no extravagant display meant to celebrate wealth. Instead, every detail reflected the quiet dignity of a man who believed his greatest achievement was never measured by profits alone, but by the lives changed through honest work. As mourners slowly entered the chapel, many paused before those photographs, realizing they were looking at the story of an entire generation that had now reached its final chapter. Inside, the atmosphere felt almost sacred. Soft sunlight filtered through stained glass windows, casting gentle colors across polished wooden pews already filled with grieving faces. Executives who had spent decades negotiating billion-dollar agreements sat silently with their heads lowered, no longer concerned with financial reports or quarterly earnings. Their tailored suits could not hide the sadness written across their expressions. Several openly wiped tears from their eyes as memories of Edward's leadership returned one after another. Across the aisle sat factory supervisors, engineers, receptionists, maintenance workers, and assembly line employees who had traveled from facilities across the country simply to honor the man who had given many of them their first opportunity to build a better life. Some held folded company caps in their hands, while others clutched old employee identification badges as quiet reminders of years spent serving a business that had become more like family than employment. There were no distinctions between executives and factory workers that morning. Titles no longer mattered. Wealth no longer mattered. Every person inside the chapel shared the same overwhelming sense that an extraordinary chapter in American industry had come to an end, leaving behind a silence that words could never fully explain. Daniel sat beside Emily near the front of the chapel, his hands folded quietly as he stared toward the polished casket surrounded by flowers. Throughout the service, memories returned with remarkable clarity. He remembered the first factory Edward had asked him to inspect, the late-night strategy sessions that stretched well past midnight, the difficult conversations during economic crises, and the reassuring words Edward had repeated through every challenge they faced together. 15 years. 15 years of sacrifice, responsibility, trust, and unwavering loyalty. Daniel thought about the birthdays he had missed while resolving company emergencies, the vacations he had postponed because employees needed leadership, the sleepless nights spent protecting contracts that kept thousands of families employed, and the countless moments Edward had looked him in the eye and confidently declared, "One day this company will be yours." Those promises had never sounded like ambition or reward. They had always sounded like responsibility. Daniel had never imagined himself inheriting wealth. What he believed he would inherit was a duty to protect Edward's life's work, preserve the company culture they had built together, and continue serving the employees who had trusted them both for so many years. Sitting quietly beside the woman he loved, Daniel felt the enormous weight of that responsibility beginning to settle upon his shoulders. Grief filled his heart, but so did determination. He silently promised Edward that the legacy they had built together would never be forgotten. As speakers rose one by one to honor Edward's memory, story after story revealed the kind of man he had truly been. A retired machinist described how Edward had secretly paid medical expenses for an employee whose child desperately needed surgery. A former executive recalled watching Edward reject profitable opportunities simply because they required closing factories in small towns that depended on Harrington manufacturing for survival. Community leaders spoke about scholarships, charitable foundations, disaster relief efforts, and countless acts of generosity that had never appeared in newspapers because Edward preferred helping people without seeking recognition. Every tribute carried the same message. Edward Harrington had built far more than a manufacturing company. He had built hope for people who believed hard work still mattered. Throughout the chapel, quiet sobs replaced restrained composure. Even seasoned executives who rarely displayed emotion found themselves overcome by grief. Employees embraced one another in silence. Some stared at the floor while others looked toward the casket, as though still expecting Edward to stand and reassure everyone that tomorrow's meeting would begin at 8 o'clock sharp, just as it always had. For a brief moment, it seemed impossible to imagine Harrington Manufacturing existing without the man whose vision had shaped every corner of the business. When the final prayer ended, many assumed the ceremony had reached its conclusion. Family members remained seated while guests quietly composed themselves, expecting a private gathering to follow where leadership responsibilities would naturally begin transitioning to Daniel. After all, no one inside that chapel doubted who had spent the last 15 years preparing for this moment. Employees glanced toward him with expressions of quiet confidence. Executives nodded respectfully whenever their eyes met his. Even those who had once questioned whether Daniel truly belonged now accepted that Edward had spent years molding him into the future guardian of the company. Daniel himself took one slow breath, preparing mentally for the difficult days that lay ahead. He knew the business would need stability. Employees would need reassurance. Customers would need confidence. There would be countless decisions to make, and he intended to honor Edward by leading with the same integrity the founder had demonstrated throughout his life. Then, before anyone could rise from their seats, the family's longtime attorney quietly stood, carrying a thick leather folder beneath one arm. He walked slowly toward the front of the chapel, adjusted his glasses, opened the folder with practiced hands, and looked across the room filled with grieving faces. The silence returned once more. This time, however, it carried something different. It carried the unmistakable feeling that the next words spoken inside that chapel would change every life gathered there forever. The attorney remained silent for several long seconds before speaking, almost as though he understood the weight of what he was about to read. The thick leather folder rested open before him, its neatly arranged pages marked with colored tabs that represented decades of legal planning, corporate decisions, estate records, and financial arrangements. Around the chapel, hundreds of eyes remained fixed upon him. No one whispered, no one shifted in their seat. Even the soft sound of people quietly weeping had faded into complete silence. Daniel looked toward the attorney with calm confidence, believing this was simply the formal beginning of a transition everyone had expected for years. Beside him, Emily reached for his hand, her fingers trembling slightly beneath the weight of grief. Executives sat with respectful expressions, already thinking about the difficult months ahead. Factory supervisors silently wondered how soon they would need to meet with Daniel to reassure employees across the country. To everyone present, the next few minutes felt like the natural continuation of a story that had been unfolding for 15 years. No one imagined they were about to witness the complete destruction of everything they believed to be true. The attorney adjusted his glasses and began reading from Edward Harrington's final corporate and estate documents, in a voice that remained steady despite the emotion filling the room. He first acknowledged Edward's charitable contributions, family trusts, philanthropic foundations, and personal wishes regarding the future of several community programs he had supported throughout his lifetime. Every sentence sounded exactly as people expected. Assets were carefully described. Financial responsibilities were assigned. Personal belongings were distributed according to Edward's instructions. The process moved methodically, leaving little room for surprise. Daniel listened respectfully without paying close attention to the legal language because he assumed the portion concerning Harrington manufacturing would come near the end. He had never been interested in inheritance for its own sake. His only concern had always been protecting the company and honoring Edward's life's work. He remembered every late-night conversation, every promise quietly spoken across conference tables, every reassuring smile that accompanied the words, "One day this company will be yours." Those memories gave him complete peace. Whatever legal language remained inside the folder, he believed it would simply confirm what Edward had already declared countless times before witnesses over the course of 15 remarkable years. Then the attorney turned another page. His expression changed almost imperceptibly, as though even he understood that what came next would be difficult to hear. He looked briefly toward Daniel before lowering his eyes once more to the document. In a measured voice that echoed throughout the silent chapel, he read, "After a complete review of all corporate ownership records, shareholder agreements, executive appointments, succession documents, trust instruments, and estate filings, it has been confirmed that Mr. Daniel Carter holds no legal ownership interest in Harrington Manufacturing." For a brief moment, the words seemed almost impossible to understand. Several people frowned, convinced they had misheard the statement. The attorney continued before anyone could interrupt. Daniel had never signed an ownership agreement. His name had never been listed as a shareholder. No succession documents appointed him as Edward's successor. No trust transferred control of the company into his hands. No corporate resolution granted him executive ownership. No inheritance documents assigned him any legal claim to the business he had spent 15 years protecting. Every sentence landed with quiet precision, each one stripping away another layer of certainty until only one devastating truth remained. On paper, Daniel owned absolutely nothing. The silence that followed felt almost unbearable. It was not the ordinary silence of grief, but the kind that settles over a room when reality suddenly refuses to match everything people believed only moments before. Executives stared at one another, searching for explanations that refused to appear. Several attorneys quietly reviewed their own copies of the documents, as though hoping an important page had somehow been overlooked. Employees sitting near the back exchanged confused glances, unable to understand how the man they had followed through economic crashes, factory fires, supply shortages, and countless sleepless nights could legally possess no place within the company he had helped save over and over again. Emily slowly turned toward her husband, her face drained of color. She wanted to speak, to ask whether there had been some terrible mistake, but the words would not come. Daniel remained perfectly still, his breathing slowed. His eyes never left the attorney standing at the front of the chapel. Memories flooded through his mind with painful clarity. 15 years of promises, 15 years of sacrifice, 15 years of believing that trust alone was enough. He did not argue because he already understood something everyone else was only beginning to realize. Every lawyer who had tried to meet with him, every accountant who had quietly asked uncomfortable questions, every warning he had dismissed with the same simple reply, "I trust my father-in-law." Those moments returned all at once, forming a picture he wished he had seen years earlier. No one moved as the attorney quietly closed one folder and reached for another sealed envelope resting beside it. Unlike the previous documents, this envelope bore no official company seal and no visible title. The attorney hesitated before breaking the seal, his expression growing even more serious than before. He looked toward the Harrington family, then toward Daniel, before quietly saying, "There is one additional matter that must now be addressed." A ripple of uncertainty passed through the chapel. If Daniel had inherited nothing, then what could possibly remain inside that final envelope? And why had Edward insisted that it be opened only after everyone had learned the truth? The days following Edward Harrington's funeral felt strangely unreal, as though the company itself had forgotten how to breathe. Employees returned to their desks, carrying the same grief they had taken home from the chapel, but something else had quietly settled over headquarters as well. It was uncertainty. Conversations stopped whenever footsteps approached. Executives who had once spoken openly now lowered their voices behind closed doors. Every hallway seemed filled with questions that no one dared ask aloud. Daniel arrived before sunrise on the first Monday after the funeral, just as he had done for the past 15 years. Habit guided him more than anything else. He parked in the same space, carried the same worn leather briefcase, greeted the same security guard with the same quiet smile, and walked toward the executive entrance, believing there was still important work waiting to be done. The company was grieving. Employees needed stability. Customers expected reassurance. Factories across the country were still depending on decisions that could not wait simply because tragedy had visited the Harrington family. Daniel had no intention of abandoning the people who had trusted him for so many years. He believed that once the shock surrounding the funeral settled, everyone would realize there had been some misunderstanding that responsible people could calmly resolve together. What he did not know was that while he had spent the weekend mourning the man he considered a second father, others had spent that same weekend preparing for an entirely different future. At first, the changes were so subtle that Daniel almost ignored them. His executive assistant avoided eye contact as he entered the building, explaining nervously that several meetings on his calendar had been canceled without explanation. Department managers who usually stopped by his office each morning suddenly remained behind closed doors. Longtime colleagues offered polite smiles but seemed strangely uncomfortable, as though they had been instructed to keep conversations brief. When Daniel walked through the production planning department, employees still greeted him warmly, yet their expressions carried confusion rather than confidence. Rumors had already begun spreading throughout the company after news from the funeral quietly reached every facility. Some workers believed Daniel had voluntarily stepped aside. Others assumed the family was reorganizing leadership before making a formal announcement. No one understood why the man who had guided Harrington Manufacturing through its most difficult years suddenly appeared to have no clear role within the company he had practically built with his own hands. Daniel dismissed the awkward atmosphere as a temporary consequence of grief. He remained convinced that patience and professionalism would eventually restore order. After all, 15 years of loyalty could not simply disappear overnight, or so he believed. By the middle of the week, patience began colliding with unmistakable reality. Daniel walked toward the executive floor, carrying reports prepared for a meeting that had somehow remained on his calendar, despite the recent confusion. When he reached the familiar hallway, he stopped without fully understanding what he was seeing. The nameplate outside his office had been removed. The frosted glass doors remained locked, even though he had never before needed a key during business hours. Assuming there had been a simple maintenance issue, Daniel asked a nearby facilities employee what was happening. The man hesitated before quietly admitting he had received instructions over the weekend to clear the office for reassignment. Inside, boxes containing 15 years of notebooks, framed photographs, engineering sketches, awards from grateful employees, and personal belongings had already been packed and stacked neatly against one wall. Daniel stood silently, unable to process how something so personal could have happened without a single phone call or conversation. That office had witnessed thousands of decisions affecting the future of the company. It was where he had spent countless nights working alongside Edward through financial crises, expansion plans, and impossible deadlines. Now it looked as though he had never belonged there at all. Several employees watched from down the hallway, their faces reflecting the same disbelief Daniel struggled to hide. As he reached into his pocket for his identification badge, hoping to enter the office and gather his thoughts, another unexpected problem appeared. The electronic reader flashed red instead of green. He tried again. The same result. A few moments later, two uniformed security officers approached quietly from the opposite end of the corridor. Daniel recognized both men immediately. He had personally approved one of their promotions years earlier after recommending improvements to company safety procedures. Their discomfort was obvious long before either of them spoke. One cleared his throat before apologizing and explaining that they had received direct instructions from the board to escort Daniel from the executive floor until further notice. They insisted the decision was administrative, not personal, and repeatedly thanked him for treating employees with kindness throughout the years. Daniel looked at them with calm understanding rather than anger. They were simply carrying out orders they had not created. Without raising his voice or demanding explanations, he handed over the temporary visitor badge they had reluctantly offered him in exchange for his employee credentials. As they walked together toward the elevator, employees quietly stepped aside, many unable to hide tears. No one spoke, no one protested. The silence hurt more than any argument ever could. When Daniel finally reached the parking garage, he decided to contact several department heads to reassure them that everything would eventually be sorted out. He unlocked his phone and opened his company email. The screen displayed an error message stating that his account no longer existed. Assuming it was a temporary technical problem, he attempted to access internal company systems from his laptop. Every password had already been disabled. Minutes later, he drove toward the exit gate, still trying to make sense of everything that had happened in less than an hour. As he approached the barrier, the electronic scanner rejected his parking access card for the first time in 15 years. A security employee hurried from the booth, visibly embarrassed, and explained that all executive access linked to Daniel's name had been permanently removed earlier that morning. Daniel nodded quietly, handed over the card, and thanked the young employee for doing his job. Then the gate lifted manually, allowing him to leave headquarters one final time. He glanced briefly into the rearview mirror as the building disappeared behind him. 15 years, thousands of sleepless nights, countless sacrifices, hundreds of employees whose lives had become intertwined with his own. And in the end, not one member of the Harrington family called to explain what was happening. Not one executive walked him to the door. Not one relative shook his hand. There was no farewell, no expression of gratitude, no acknowledgement of everything he had given. Only silence. And somewhere inside the executive offices he had just left behind, a meeting was beginning that would reveal the betrayal ran much deeper than losing a job. For the first time in 15 years, Daniel Carter woke on a weekday morning with nowhere he was expected to be. There were no production reports waiting on his desk, no emergency calls from factory managers, no supplier negotiations filling his calendar, and no late-night strategy meetings with Edward Harrington. The silence inside his own home felt unfamiliar, almost uncomfortable, after years of measuring his days by the constant demands of Harrington Manufacturing. Friends urged him to hire an aggressive attorney immediately and challenge everything in court. Former colleagues quietly suggested speaking to the media before the Harrington family controlled the public narrative. Others encouraged him to walk away entirely and begin a new chapter somewhere else. Daniel ignored every piece of advice. Something deep inside him refused to believe that Edward had deliberately deceived him. During 15 years of working side by side, he had seen too much kindness, too much integrity, and too many moments when Edward had sacrificed profits to protect ordinary employees. None of that matched the image of a man who would intentionally erase someone who had devoted his life to the company. Daniel believed there had to be another explanation. Instead of preparing for a legal battle, he decided to begin with something much simpler. He would quietly ask questions, not to accuse anyone, but to understand how a promise repeated for 15 years could disappear the moment Edward was gone. His first visit was to the home of Harold Bennett, a retired accountant who had spent more than 3 decades overseeing Harrington Manufacturing's financial records before retiring several years earlier. Harold welcomed Daniel warmly, surprised to see him standing at the front door carrying nothing more than a notebook and a respectful smile. They sat together on a quiet back porch overlooking a small lake, while the afternoon sun slowly disappeared behind the trees. Daniel carefully explained everything that had happened since the funeral, never raising his voice or speaking bitterly about the Harrington family. Harold listened without interrupting, his expression growing more troubled with every passing minute. When Daniel finally asked whether Edward had ever discussed ownership or succession planning, the elderly accountant remained silent for a long time. Finally, he admitted that Edward had often spoken about Daniel as though he would one day lead the company. "He believed in you more than anyone," Harold said quietly. "I heard him say it countless times." Daniel leaned forward hopefully, asking whether any paperwork reflected those intentions. Harold slowly shook his head. "That's the part I've never understood," he replied. "Edward talked about your future constantly, but I never saw the legal documents that matched those conversations. Those words offered no answers. They only deepened the mystery." Over the following weeks, Daniel met with several retired executives who had helped build Harrington Manufacturing during its most successful years. Many had long since left the company, spending their retirement traveling, enjoying family, or quietly watching the business continue growing from a distance. Nearly every conversation followed the same pattern. Each executive described Edward as a man who trusted Daniel completely. They remembered board meetings where Edward publicly praised Daniel's leadership, private dinners where he referred to Daniel as the future of this company, and countless occasions when he openly stated that no one else understood the business the way Daniel did. One former operations director laughed sadly as he recalled Edward refusing to make an important decision until Daniel returned from an overseas business trip. "He wouldn't even approve a factory expansion without hearing your opinion first," the retired executive said with genuine disbelief. "If someone had asked me who would eventually run Harrington Manufacturing, I would have answered your name without thinking twice. Yet every time Daniel asked the question that mattered most, whether anyone had ever seen official documents naming him as Edward's successor, the answers became frustratingly similar. Heads slowly shook. Eyes looked away. No one had actually seen the paperwork. Everyone believed it existed because Edward spoke with such certainty. But belief in evidence had quietly become two very different things. The conversations grew even more unsettling when Daniel located several attorneys who had represented Harrington Manufacturing at different stages throughout its history. Some had retired, others had moved into private practice after leaving corporate law. None of them were willing to discuss confidential legal matters in detail, but several admitted they remembered raising questions years earlier regarding succession planning. One attorney recalled recommending that Edward formally document future leadership to avoid confusion should anything unexpected happen. Another remembered preparing draft materials related to executive governance, though he could not confirm whether those documents had ever been finalized. A third lawyer paused thoughtfully before saying something Daniel would never forget. Edward always spoke as though he had more time, he explained quietly. Every time the subject came up, he said he would finish everything soon. Daniel felt a growing weight settle inside him. It sounded as though Edward genuinely intended to protect the future he had promised. Yet intention alone had accomplished nothing. Somewhere between planning and action, something had interrupted the process. Whether it had been illness, misplaced trust, legal complications, or something far more deliberate remained impossible to determine. The closer Daniel moved toward the truth, the more distant that truth seemed to become. By the end of the month, Daniel's notebook had become filled with names, dates, memories, and conversations that all pointed toward the same heartbreaking conclusion. Different people from different periods of the company's history, many of whom had not spoken to one another in years, all repeated remarkably similar observations. Edward intended something. He trusted Daniel more than anyone. He expected Daniel to protect the company after he was gone. He spoke about that future openly and confidently. But when it came to the legal documents that should have transformed those promises into reality, no one could explain what had happened. There was no missing contract anyone could produce. No forgotten will waiting to be discovered. No retired executive who secretly possessed the answers. Instead, there was only a trail of unfinished conversations and good intentions that seemed to vanish whenever Daniel reached the point where evidence should have existed. As he closed his notebook one quiet evening, he realized he had uncovered the most painful truth so far. The people who knew Edward best all believed he meant to keep his promise, yet not one of them could tell Daniel why he never did. And somewhere, hidden beneath 15 years of loyalty, trust, and silence, the missing piece of the story was still waiting to be found. The answers Daniel was searching for were no longer going to come from conversations alone. Every retired executive, accountant, and attorney had offered pieces of the same puzzle, yet none of them could explain why Edward Harrington's spoken promises had never become legally enforceable. If the truth still existed anywhere, Daniel believed it had to be hidden inside the company's history itself. Harrington Manufacturing had operated for decades, producing millions of pages of contracts, engineering plans, financial statements, legal correspondence, board minutes, property deeds, and corporate filings. Businesses of that size did not simply forget important decisions. They documented everything. Somewhere among those countless records, Daniel hoped to find the missing link between Edward's repeated promises and the devastating reality revealed at the funeral. Since he no longer had access to company headquarters, he turned to people who had spent years preserving old archives. Former records managers, retired administrative assistants, warehouse supervisors, and off-site document custodians quietly agreed to help him search through materials that had long since been moved into storage. Most of the files were no longer considered active business records, making them easier to review. Daniel never asked anyone to violate the law or reveal confidential information. He simply wanted to understand the history he had helped create. Deep inside, he still believed the truth had been written somewhere. He only needed to find it before time erased the final clues forever. His search led him to an aging warehouse on the outskirts of the city, where thousands of retired company documents had been stored for years, inside rows of metal shelving that stretched farther than the eye could comfortably follow. Dust floated through narrow beams of sunlight filtering from small windows high above the concrete floor. Cardboard boxes, carefully labeled with faded handwriting, contained decades of Harrington Manufacturing's forgotten history. Some held factory inspection reports from the 1980s, Others contained supplier agreements, expansion proposals, insurance records, engineering blueprints, and correspondence between executives whose names had long since disappeared from company directories. Daniel spent entire days opening one box after another, carefully reading documents that most people would have considered meaningless. To him, every page represented another opportunity to understand how the company had evolved and whether Edward had ever begun preparing for the transition he had spoken about so confidently. Occasionally, he found handwritten notes in Edward's familiar script, praising operational improvements Daniel had introduced years earlier. Other folders contained strategic planning sessions where Edward repeatedly emphasized that leadership should always remain in the hands of the person who best understood the company, rather than the person with the loudest voice. Those discoveries encouraged Daniel, but none of them explained why his name remained absent from every document that truly mattered. As the search continued, strange inconsistencies began emerging from the mountain of paperwork. Several files contained references to meetings whose official minutes could no longer be located. Numbered folders skipped unexpectedly from one sequence to another, suggesting entire sections had been removed at some point in the past. One retired records supervisor quietly admitted that certain legal files had been transferred years earlier to a private storage facility at the request of outside counsel, though he could no longer remember who had authorized the move. Daniel carefully recorded every irregularity inside his notebook. Then came something even more unsettling. While reviewing archived contract files related to one of the company's largest factory expansions, he discovered signature pages attached to agreements where one signature line remained completely blank. Edward's signature appeared exactly where expected. Witnesses had signed their names. Corporate seals had been applied, yet another designated signature space had never been completed. Daniel could not determine whose name had originally been intended for that line because the corresponding cover page was missing. It might have been nothing more than an administrative oversight, or it might have represented something far more significant. For the first time since beginning his investigation, Daniel felt the uncomfortable possibility that unfinished paperwork had become a recurring pattern rather than an isolated mistake. The deeper he looked, the stranger the company's paper trail became. During one visit to an older records facility scheduled for demolition, Daniel noticed several shelves containing damaged archive boxes marked as records affected by a warehouse fire many years earlier. Most of the documents inside had survived with only minor smoke damage, but others had been partially destroyed by water, heat, or hurried recovery efforts. Burned edges surrounded contracts that could no longer be fully read. Pages had fused together after exposure to moisture. Entire sections of correspondence had become impossible to reconstruct because ink had faded beyond recognition. A retired facilities manager explained that everyone had assumed the damaged records held little long-term value because duplicate copies supposedly existed elsewhere. Yet when Daniel attempted to locate those duplicates, many could not be found. Some files simply ended without explanation. Others referred to attachments that no longer accompanied the original documents. Standing among shelves filled with damaged history, Daniel realized something unsettling. The truth did not appear to have disappeared through one dramatic act. Instead, it seemed to have been lost little by little over many years through missing files, incomplete records, forgotten transfers, and paperwork left unfinished. Whether those gaps resulted from coincidence, carelessness, or deliberate decisions remained impossible to prove. One evening, after organizing weeks of notes across his dining room table, Daniel stepped back and looked at everything he had gathered. Individually, each discovery seemed insignificant. A missing meeting record, an unsigned document, burned files, incomplete contracts, legal references without supporting paperwork. Together, however, they formed a pattern that was becoming increasingly difficult to ignore. Edward Harrington had repeatedly spoken about the future with absolute certainty, yet the official records surrounding that future looked strangely incomplete, as though someone had begun building a bridge but never finished laying the final sections. Daniel circled one sentence in his notebook before quietly closing it for the night. Promises existed everywhere. Proof existed nowhere. The mystery was no longer simply about whether Edward intended to keep his word. It had become a question of what happened between intention and execution. Somewhere inside those missing pages, blank signature lines and forgotten storage boxes rested the answer that had already cost Daniel 15 years of his life. The only question now was whether the final piece of evidence had been lost forever, or whether someone had worked very hard to ensure it would never be found. While Daniel buried himself in forgotten records and decades of corporate paperwork, Emily found herself unable to stay away from the one place in her father's home that still felt as though he might walk back into it at any moment. Edward Harrington's private study had remained almost untouched since the day of his funeral. The large oak desk still held neatly stacked folders, arranged exactly as he had left them. A reading lamp remained angled toward the leather chair where he had spent countless evenings reviewing contracts and writing notes long after everyone else had gone to bed. Shelves lined every wall, filled with biographies of American industrial pioneers, business journals marked with handwritten observations, framed photographs of factory openings, family vacations, and employees celebrating company milestones. Even the faint scent of old leather and freshly brewed coffee seemed unwilling to disappear. Emily often found herself sitting quietly in that room without opening a single file. It was the one place where grief felt honest. Away from lawyers, board meetings, inheritance disputes, and whispered conversations, the study still belonged to the father she had always known, rather than the complicated legacy everyone else now argued over. Yet every visit also brought back the same painful question she had tried desperately to ignore since the funeral. If her father truly intended Daniel to lead the company, why had he left behind nothing capable of proving it? Several weeks after the funeral, Emily returned to the study with a simple intention. She wanted to organize some of her father's personal belongings before the house eventually passed through the formal estate process. She carefully sorted family photographs into small boxes, folded handwritten letters from old friends, and placed several personal journals inside protective cases so they would not be damaged by time. As she worked, she noticed something she had somehow overlooked during every previous visit. Built into the wall behind one of the bookcases stood a narrow wooden cabinet, unlike the others surrounding it. It was slightly darker than the rest of the shelves, almost as though it had been added years after the room was originally constructed. A small brass lock secured its doors, polished smooth from decades of use. Emily stared at it for several moments, trying to remember the last time she had ever seen her father open it. Surprisingly, she could not remember a single occasion. Growing up, she had accepted that certain parts of her father's office were private. She had never questioned them because Edward never gave her reason to. But now, standing alone in the silent room, the locked cabinet seemed less like ordinary furniture and more like a question waiting patiently for someone to answer it. Emily searched the study carefully for nearly an hour without finding anything that resembled a key. She checked desk drawers, old filing cabinets, decorative boxes, and even the pockets of several jackets still hanging inside a nearby closet. Nothing. Frustrated, she sat down in her father's chair and allowed her eyes to wander slowly around the room once again. That was when her attention settled upon an old wooden clock resting quietly on a bookshelf opposite the desk. The clock had never worked properly, yet Edward had refused to replace it because it had belonged to his own father. Remembering how protective he had always been of family keepsakes, Emily gently lifted the clock to dust beneath it. Something small struck the wooden shelf with a soft metallic sound. She looked down and discovered a tiny brass key taped carefully beneath the base of the clock, hidden so naturally that no one would have noticed it without moving the heirloom itself. Emily held the key in her hand for several seconds without speaking. Her father had always believed important things deserved careful protection. Suddenly, she understood that whatever rested inside the locked cabinet had mattered enough for him to hide its key, where only someone paying close attention might eventually discover it. Her hands trembled slightly as she crossed the room and inserted the old brass key into the cabinet's lock. For a brief moment it resisted, as though years of disuse had forgotten how to turn. Then, with a quiet click, the lock finally released. Emily slowly opened the cabinet doors, expecting to find legal documents, property deeds, or perhaps family keepsakes too valuable to leave elsewhere. Instead, she found only a handful of carefully arranged items resting neatly on a single shelf. There were several faded photographs wrapped in protective paper, a small wooden box containing old fountain pens, and lying beneath them all, a thick black notebook bound in worn leather. Unlike the official company records Daniel had spent weeks searching through, this notebook carried no corporate logo, no legal labels, and no identifying marks beyond the visible wear created by years of regular use. Emily immediately recognized the handwriting on the first page before she had even begun reading. Every word belonged unmistakably to Edward. It was not a business ledger or financial record. It was deeply personal. Her father had written inside it by hand, page after page, over what appeared to be many years. As Emily gently turned the first few pages, She realized she was holding something no attorney had mentioned, no executor had referenced, and no family member seemed to know existed. She sat quietly in her father's chair as afternoon sunlight slowly drifted across the room, reading only enough to understand that this notebook was unlike anything she had expected to find. The entries were dated, thoughtful, and remarkably honest. Edward wrote about difficult business decisions, moments of personal doubt, lessons learned through failure, and people who had shaped both his life and his company. Certain names appeared repeatedly throughout the pages, but one name surfaced more often than any other: Daniel. Sometimes Edward described his admiration for Daniel's work ethic. Other times he reflected on conversations they had shared late at night after impossible days inside the office. Several passages spoke about trust in a way that brought tears to Emily's eyes because they sounded exactly like the father she remembered. Yet before she could continue reading further, one folded sheet of paper slipped from between the pages and landed softly on the floor. Emily reached down to pick it up, noticing that unlike the notebook itself, the folded page bore no date at all. Whatever Edward had written there had been deliberately tucked away, hidden between the entries as though waiting for the right person to discover it. Emily unfolded the paper slowly, unaware that the first sentence written in her father's own hand was about to change everything she believed she knew about the promise he had made to Daniel. Emily's hands trembled as she carefully turned the fragile pages of the worn leather notebook. Unlike the polished legal files that had dominated the weeks following Edward Harrington's funeral, these pages carried something far more personal. The ink was unmistakably her father's, written in the same careful handwriting she had seen for decades on birthday cards, family letters, and notes left on his desk. There were no corporate letterheads, no official seals, and no language designed for lawyers or accountants. This was Edward speaking only to himself. Every entry revealed thoughts he had never shared publicly, moments of uncertainty he had hidden behind confidence, and reflections that no board member, executive, or family relative had ever been allowed to hear. Emily immediately understood why the notebook had been hidden inside a locked cabinet. It was never meant for the business world. It was the private record of a man carrying responsibilities that few people could truly understand. She settled deeper into the leather chair, completely unaware of how profoundly these pages would change her understanding of both her father and the heartbreaking events that followed his death. The earliest entries described ordinary business challenges from years before Daniel had entered the Harrington family. Edward wrote about difficult economic conditions, sleepless nights spent worrying about employees, and the enormous pressure of protecting a company that supported thousands of American families. But as Emily continued reading, another name slowly began appearing with increasing frequency: Daniel. At first, Edward simply mentioned the young man who had started dating his daughter. He admitted that he had initially questioned whether Daniel understood the enormous responsibility attached to becoming part of the Harrington family. Yet only a few pages later, Edward's tone had already begun changing. He described Daniel as disciplined, thoughtful, and remarkably honest. One entry recalled the first factory visit where Daniel spent nearly an entire day speaking with machine operators instead of senior managers because he believed the people closest to the work often understood problems better than executives sitting inside conference rooms. Edward wrote that very few young professionals possess that kind of humility. "He listens before he speaks," one sentence read. "That cannot be taught." Emily smiled through quiet tears because she recognized exactly the man her father was describing. Long before anyone else had fully accepted Daniel, Edward had already begun seeing qualities that would eventually earn his complete trust. As the years passed inside the notebook, admiration gradually transformed into something even deeper. Edward documented one challenge after another, and almost every difficult moment contained another example of Daniel quietly placing the company ahead of himself. There were entries describing financial crises where Daniel refused bonuses so employee wages could be protected. Others recalled severe winter storms that threatened production schedules, only for Daniel to spend nights sleeping inside factory offices so he could coordinate emergency repairs before workers arrived each morning. Edward wrote about watching Daniel comfort employees after layoffs became unavoidable during economic downturns, personally calling families affected rather than allowing impersonal letters to deliver devastating news. Several entries simply described long evenings when the two men remained inside headquarters discussing the future of the business after everyone else had gone home. Edward repeatedly referred to Daniel as the kind of leader every company hopes to find once in a lifetime. One particularly emotional passage read, "He protects this company as though he built it himself, yet he has never once asked what it will someday give him in return. Emily paused after reading those words. They sounded almost identical to the conversations she remembered hearing between her father and Daniel throughout the years. Every promise Edward had ever spoken suddenly felt genuine because the notebook proved he had believed those words with all his heart. Then the tone of the journal slowly began changing. The confident businessman who had filled earlier pages with certainty started revealing emotions he had hidden from everyone around him. Edward wrote openly about growing older, about feeling time slipping away faster than expected, and about the quiet fear that illness might prevent him from finishing responsibilities he had postponed for far too long. Several entries mentioned meetings with attorneys, discussions about estate planning, and reminders to complete important legal work. Again and again, Edward promised himself he would finalize everything soon. One page simply read, "Daniel has earned certainty, not another promise." Another entry admitted, "I keep believing there will be more time." Emily felt her chest tighten as she realized her father had fully understood the importance of putting his intentions into legally binding documents. He had not ignored the issue because he failed to appreciate its significance. He delayed because he believed tomorrow would always arrive. The notebook revealed a man trapped by the dangerous assumption that good intentions could safely wait until life became less complicated. They never did. Each passing year seemed to convince Edward there would always be another opportunity to finish what remained unfinished. Emily read until evening. Shadows filled the room, desperately searching for the one entry that would explain everything. She expected to find a reference to a hidden trust, unsigned transfer documents, or instructions directing someone to complete the succession process after Edward's death. Instead, the notebook ended with quiet reflections rather than legal solutions. Edward's final pages expressed gratitude for Daniel's loyalty, pride in the company they had built together, and deep concern about leaving unfinished responsibilities behind. There were heartfelt words of admiration. There were painful admissions of regret. There were honest fears that his health might fail before everything had been properly arranged. But when Emily closed the notebook and looked back through its final pages one last time, one devastating truth remained impossible to escape. Nowhere did Edward write that ownership had been legally transferred. Nowhere did he mention completed shareholder agreements, executed succession documents, or signed inheritance papers. The notebook proved beyond any doubt that Edward intended Daniel to inherit far more than a job. It proved he trusted him more than anyone else. It proved he regretted every delay. Yet it also proved something equally heartbreaking. Good intentions, no matter how sincere, had never become legal reality. And somewhere beyond the pages of that notebook, another piece of Edward's unfinished story was still waiting to be uncovered. Daniel had spent weeks searching for a mistake. Instead, he found something far more unsettling. Every conversation, every forgotten file, every unfinished document seemed to point toward the same impossible conclusion. Edward Harrington had intended for Daniel to protect the company, yet somehow that intention had never become legal reality. For a long time, Daniel believed the tragedy had been nothing more than a heartbreaking failure to complete the paperwork before Edward's death. But as more pieces fell into place, another possibility slowly emerged. What if the missing signatures were not simply forgotten? What if someone had benefited from making sure they never appeared at all? The question refused to leave his mind. It followed him through every notebook, every retired executive's recollection, and every box of archived records. Someone had gained extraordinary wealth from Daniel's exclusion. Someone had gained power. And when enormous fortunes are involved, opportunity often attracts motives that remain hidden until it is far too late. Emily reached the same conclusion from an entirely different direction. As she reread her father's journal, she noticed several entries describing meetings that had been postponed without explanation. Edward repeatedly reminded himself to finish the succession documents. Yet each reminder was followed by another interruption, another urgent crisis, another delay. More troubling still, one entry mentioned a trusted advisor insisting that everything could wait until the next review. Emily stopped reading and stared at the page. Her father had never been careless about important business matters. If he delayed something this significant, had he been persuaded that there was no urgency? Had someone quietly encouraged him to postpone the very paperwork that would have protected Daniel? She remembered the whispered conversations after family dinners, the remarks she had overheard behind closed doors, and the confidence with which certain relatives spoke about the company remaining within the Harrington bloodline. For the first time, those memories no longer felt unrelated. Daniel quietly revisited everyone who had played a role in the company's legal history. This time, he asked a different question. He no longer asked whether Edward intended to make him his successor. Everyone already agreed on that point. Instead, he asked who had access to the succession process itself, who reviewed the drafts, who scheduled the meetings, who handled the final documents. The answers revealed the same small circle of influential people appearing again and again. None of them openly admitted wrongdoing. None of them accused anyone else. Yet several described unusual delays, canceled appointments, and unexplained requests to hold off for now. One retired advisor even admitted that he had always found those delays unusual because Edward had rarely postponed important decisions once his mind was made up. Standing alone, none of those details proved anything. Together, they painted a picture that was becoming increasingly difficult to ignore. Then Daniel discovered one final detail hidden among months of notes. Every delay had produced the same result. Every postponed signature protected the exact same group of people. Every unfinished document ensured that ownership remained unchanged. Whether those events were caused by fear, self-interest, or careful manipulation remained uncertain. But one fact could no longer be denied. Someone had benefited every single time the paperwork failed to move forward. Daniel closed his notebook and looked toward the headquarters he had once helped build, realizing that the greatest battle was no longer about recovering a fortune. It was about uncovering the truth. If someone had quietly kept Edward's final promise from becoming reality, that secret had survived the founder's death. And before Daniel could reclaim his future, he would have to expose the person who had the most to gain from his absence. Months after Edward Harrington's funeral, the quiet search for answers reached a point where silence could no longer resolve what had been left behind. Daniel had resisted the courtroom for as long as he possibly could. He had not wanted headlines, public accusations, or a legal battle against the family he had once considered his own. For 15 years, he had believed trust was stronger than contracts, loyalty more valuable than ownership, and a man's word more meaningful than a signature. That belief had shaped every major decision of his adult life. But the notebook Emily discovered, the missing records, the unfinished meetings, and the countless conversations with retired executives all pointed toward the same heartbreaking conclusion. Too many questions remained unanswered to simply walk away. Daniel finally instructed his legal team to petition the court not to rewrite Edward's wishes, but to determine whether those wishes had ever been interrupted, delayed, or improperly handled. It was a case unlike most inheritance disputes. Daniel was not asking the court to reward him for years of hard work alone. He wanted one thing above everything else. He wanted the complete truth, wherever that truth ultimately led. As news of the legal proceedings spread across the business community, thousands of people who had watched Harrington Manufacturing grow over decades quietly began following every development, wondering whether justice could still be found after so much time had already been lost. The hearings attracted extraordinary attention. Courtrooms filled each day with reporters, former employees, financial analysts, retired executives, and members of the Harrington family who had not spoken to one another since Edward's funeral. Thick binders of business records were carried into the courtroom, alongside aging financial ledgers, board meeting minutes, estate planning correspondence, and corporate governance documents dating back more than 2 decades. Every page seemed capable of answering one question while raising 2 more. Attorneys carefully reconstructed the company's history, presenting timelines showing Daniel's gradual rise from an outsider to the executive responsible for nearly every major operational success the business had experienced during the previous 15 years. Contracts bearing Daniel's recommendations, strategic reports in his handwriting, performance reviews praising his leadership, and internal memoranda describing him as Edward's most trusted advisor were examined one after another. No one disputed Daniel's contribution to the company's extraordinary growth. Even attorneys representing opposing interests acknowledged that his leadership had transformed Harrington Manufacturing into one of America's most respected privately owned manufacturers. Yet the courtroom was not deciding who deserved recognition. It was trying to determine whether Edward's clearly expressed intentions had ever become legally effective, or whether something had prevented that process from reaching completion. One by one, witnesses took the stand. Former factory managers described nights when Daniel remained inside damaged facilities until every employee had safely returned home after equipment failures and natural disasters. Retired department heads recalled watching him decline personal rewards so company resources could be directed toward protecting jobs during difficult economic periods. Senior accountants testified that Edward had repeatedly introduced Daniel as the future of the company during executive planning sessions. A retired operations director explained that major decisions were rarely finalized until Daniel had personally reviewed them because Edward trusted his judgment above everyone else's. Even longtime employees who had spent their entire careers on production lines spoke emotionally about the respect Daniel had earned through years of quiet leadership rather than public recognition. Their testimony did not establish legal ownership, but it painted a remarkably consistent picture of the relationship between Edward and the man he had spent years preparing to lead the business. As each witness stepped down, the courtroom grew quieter. The story emerging from dozens of independent voices sounded almost identical, despite coming from people whose paths had not crossed in years. Then attention shifted from memories to documents. Lawyers carefully compared meeting schedules, estate planning notes, draft agreements, archive correspondence, and records recovered during Daniel's months of investigation. Experts explained how succession planning normally progressed within privately owned companies of Harrington manufacturing size. Several unfinished drafts appeared to show that discussions regarding future leadership had indeed taken place over a number of years, although many of those materials remained incomplete or unsigned. Missing pages, canceled appointments, and postponed reviews became important topics of examination as attorneys attempted to reconstruct events that had unfolded long before Edward's health began declining. Every new record answered part of the mystery while leaving other pieces unresolved. The courtroom slowly moved beyond assumptions and emotional speeches towards something far more powerful, carefully examined evidence. For the first time since the funeral, the unanswered questions surrounding Edward's final intentions were no longer hidden inside private conversations. They were being examined openly, methodically, and under oath. As the proceedings continued, one undeniable truth began emerging from the testimony, regardless of where individual witnesses believed the responsibility ultimately belonged. Edward Harrington had repeatedly expressed confidence in Daniel's leadership. Daniel had devoted 15 years to building a company he believed he had been entrusted to protect. And somewhere between Edward's spoken promises and the official records preserved by the company, a profound disconnect had developed that no one had fully understood while Edward was alive. Whether that disconnect resulted from delay, misunderstanding, unfinished legal work, or other circumstances remained the central question before the court. Day after day, more pieces of the story surfaced, replacing speculation with documented facts and sworn testimony. Daniel sat quietly through every hearing, rarely speaking unless directly questioned, listening as the history of his own life was reconstructed page by page before strangers. He had entered the courtroom searching for justice. What he was beginning to discover was something even more valuable. The truth, however painful, was finally beginning to step out of the shadows. And with each passing day, it moved one step closer to revealing what had really happened during the final chapter of Edward Harrington's life. There are moments in life when the pursuit of justice quietly transforms into the discovery of something even greater. For Daniel Carter, that moment did not arrive inside a courtroom. It did not come from a judge's ruling, a forgotten document, or a dramatic legal victory. It arrived on an ordinary morning as he stood alone outside a small neighborhood coffee shop after another exhausting day of testimony. His phone, which had remained strangely quiet since the funeral, suddenly began filling with messages. At first, there were only a handful, then dozens, then hundreds. Former employees, retired supervisors, factory managers, receptionists, engineers, truck drivers, maintenance workers. People Daniel had worked beside over the course of 15 years were reaching out, not because anyone had asked them to, but because they wanted him to know something he had been unable to see while fighting to prove what had been taken from him. One message simply read, "You gave me my first promotion when nobody else believed in me." Another said, "You kept our factory open when everyone thought we'd lose our jobs." Another ended with the words, "No document can erase what you've done for us." Daniel lowered the phone slowly and, for the first time since Edward's funeral, felt tears he had spent months holding back. Over the following weeks, those messages became something far larger than anyone expected. Former employees began sharing stories with one another, remembering moments Daniel himself had long forgotten. A retired machinist recalled how Daniel had personally visited his home after a workplace injury to assure his family that his position would still be waiting whenever he recovered. A young engineer described how Daniel had encouraged her to pursue leadership opportunities despite being told she lacked experience. A factory supervisor remembered Daniel spending an entire night helping employees restore production after a devastating equipment failure rather than leaving the work to someone else. Community leaders spoke about scholarships Daniel had quietly funded through anonymous donations after learning that several employees' children could not afford college. One family described receiving groceries delivered to their front porch during the economic downturn, only discovering years later that Daniel had arranged everything without ever attaching his name to the act of kindness. Story after story emerged, each one carrying the same message. Daniel had never measured leadership by titles or ownership. He had measured it by people. Without realizing it, he had spent 15 years building something that no legal document could ever grant or take away. As those stories spread, an extraordinary change began unfolding across Harrington Manufacturing. Employees who had remained silent after the funeral slowly found the courage to speak openly. They did not gather because anyone instructed them to. They came together because gratitude had finally overcome fear. Retired executives publicly acknowledged Daniel's leadership. Former department heads signed letters describing the role he had played in saving the company during its most difficult years. Longtime suppliers praised his honesty during contract negotiations. Community organizations honored his commitment to protecting American jobs when many companies had chosen easier paths. Local newspapers shifted their attention away from inheritance disputes and began telling stories about the man who had quietly transformed thousands of lives without ever demanding recognition. Daniel watched all of this unfold with quiet disbelief. For months, he had believed everything meaningful had ended the day security escorted him from headquarters. Now he was beginning to understand that what truly mattered had never been locked behind those office doors. Respect could not be disabled with an access card. Integrity could not be deleted by removing an email account. Trust earned over 15 years could not disappear because his name was missing from corporate records. Then came the day that changed Daniel forever. Employees from factories across the country organized a gathering at a community center not far from the company's original headquarters. No reporters had arranged it. No corporation sponsored it. Thousands of current and former employees attended simply because they wanted to thank the man they still considered their leader. Families traveled hundreds of miles carrying old company photographs, retirement plaques, faded identification badges, and handwritten letters Daniel had sent during difficult moments throughout the years. One by one, people stood before the audience to describe how his quiet acts of leadership had shaped their lives. Some spoke about careers. Others spoke about marriages, children, illnesses, or moments when Daniel's encouragement had arrived exactly when hope seemed impossible to find. Looking across that sea of familiar faces, Daniel realized something so powerful that it completely changed the way he viewed everything that had happened since Edward's death. For months, he had believed he was fighting to reclaim an inheritance. In truth, the most valuable inheritance had been in front of him all along. Edward had certainly built factories, machines, contracts, and extraordinary wealth. But the greatest legacy either man had helped create was a culture where people believed character mattered more than power. That legacy was alive in every person standing before him. As the gathering came to an end, the crowd rose to its feet without anyone asking. The applause continued for what felt like an eternity. Daniel looked around the room and saw faces representing every chapter of the life he had devoted to Harrington Manufacturing. Young employees just beginning their careers stood beside retirees who had spent 40 years building the company. Executives stood beside factory workers. Office staff embraced maintenance crews. In that moment, Daniel finally understood what Edward had tried to teach him all those years ago, even if neither of them had imagined the lesson would arrive this way. Companies can be inherited, buildings can be sold, shares can be transferred, titles can be taken away, fortunes can disappear, but a reputation earned through honesty, sacrifice, humility, and service belongs to no courtroom, no board of directors, and no legal document. It lives inside the people whose lives have been changed by it. As thousands of employees stood behind Daniel, not because they had to, but because they chose to, he realized that although someone may have succeeded in keeping his name off every official piece of paper, they had failed to erase it from the only place where a true legacy is written, the hearts of the people he had spent 15 years serving. That was one inheritance no one could ever take away. The months that followed became a lesson that balance sheets alone could never fully explain. On paper, Harrington Manufacturing still possessed enormous wealth. Its factories remained standing. Its equipment continued operating. Its contracts had not disappeared overnight. The board assured investors, suppliers, and employees that the transition had been carefully managed and that the company remained stronger than ever. Public statements projected confidence. Press releases praised the organization's experienced leadership team and promised that the company's future was secure. From a distance, everything appeared stable. Yet inside the business, something far more difficult to measure had quietly vanished. The steady presence that employees had relied upon for 15 years was no longer there. Daniel had never believed leadership was about giving orders. He believed it meant earning trust, one conversation, one decision, and one difficult day at a time. That kind of leadership could not simply be replaced by appointing another executive or rewriting an organizational chart. Although the buildings looked exactly the same, the spirit that had held thousands of people together had begun slipping away, almost unnoticed at first. The earliest signs appeared in places that rarely attracted public attention. Decisions that Daniel once resolved in a single afternoon now remained trapped inside endless committee meetings. Department leaders who had always felt comfortable sharing concerns became reluctant to speak openly, uncertain whether honesty would still be welcomed. Small operational problems lingered until they became expensive ones. Managers who had built their careers under Daniel's patient guidance quietly accepted offers from competitors, explaining to friends that the company no longer felt like the place they had devoted their lives to. Several longtime supervisors chose early retirement rather than adapting to a culture that seemed increasingly focused on authority instead of cooperation. Those departures did not generate dramatic headlines, but inside every factory they were deeply felt. Experience walked out the door carrying decades of practical knowledge that no handbook could replace. New leaders inherited impressive titles, yet many struggled to earn the confidence that Daniel had spent years building through consistency rather than position. Employees continued reporting for work each morning, but conversations during lunch breaks gradually changed from optimism about the future to quiet memories of how things used to be. The effects slowly reached beyond the factory walls. Customers who had worked with Harrington Manufacturing for years began noticing subtle differences. Responses to urgent requests arrived more slowly. Problems that once received immediate personal attention were redirected through layers of administration. Relationships built on trust became increasingly transactional. Several long-standing clients, frustrated by delays and inconsistent communication, quietly awarded new contracts elsewhere. Suppliers who had admired Daniel's straightforward negotiations found themselves dealing with executives who seemed more interested in protecting appearances than solving shared challenges. None of these changes alone threatened the company. Together, however, they began creating a pattern that became impossible to ignore. Quarterly reports no longer reflected the remarkable growth everyone had come to expect. Expansion plans were postponed. Production targets became more difficult to achieve. Profit margins narrowed under the weight of avoidable mistakes. Analysts searching for financial explanations focused on market conditions, competition, and economic uncertainty. Very few recognized the deeper issue. The company had not simply lost an executive, it had lost the culture that executive had quietly protected for 15 years. What made the decline especially painful was its irony. Daniel had spent much of his adult life sacrificing personal ambitions to preserve Harrington Manufacturing through recessions, supply shortages, factory fires, and countless crises that threatened its future. He had believed the company was worth protecting because it represented thousands of families whose livelihoods depended upon its success. Yet after removing the very person who had devoted himself to that mission, the organization found itself struggling with challenges far smaller than those it had once overcome together. Sitting quietly at home one evening, Daniel read another business article discussing the company's declining performance. He felt no satisfaction. There was no sense of victory in watching something he loved begin to weaken. Instead, he quietly closed the newspaper and reflected on a truth that Edward had understood long before anyone else. Buildings, machinery, patents, and contracts can create a business, but people create a legacy. When loyalty is treated as temporary, trust as expendable, and character as less valuable than control, even the strongest empire begins to lose the very foundation that made its success possible. And although few people inside Harrington Manufacturing were willing to admit it aloud, many had already begun asking themselves the same difficult question. What if the greatest asset the company ever possessed was never listed on a balance sheet at all? Daniel Carter never expected his phone to become busy again. For weeks after leaving Harrington Manufacturing, the silence had been almost overwhelming. Calls that once filled every hour of every day had suddenly disappeared. Meetings stopped, emails vanished. His calendar, once planned months in advance, remained almost completely empty. At first, the quiet felt like another painful reminder of everything he had lost. But as news of the court hearing spread and more people learned the full story behind his 15 years of sacrifice, that silence slowly gave way to something entirely unexpected. The first call came from the chief executive of a respected manufacturing firm in the Midwest. He had followed Daniel's career for years from a distance and offered him the opportunity to lead a major division with complete operational authority. Daniel thanked him sincerely but explained that he was not yet ready to make such a decision. A few days later, another call arrived, this time from an investment group that specialized in rebuilding established American manufacturers. They had no interest in discussing the Harrington family's legal disputes. Their interest was much simpler. They believed Daniel possessed the kind of leadership that could build extraordinary businesses wherever he chose to work. Similar conversations followed throughout the month, each one carrying the same message. While one company had removed his title, the rest of the business world had not forgotten the reputation he had spent 15 years earning. The offers continued arriving from every direction. Some involved executive leadership positions with salaries far exceeding anything Daniel had ever earned at Harrington Manufacturing. Others proposed partnerships that would allow him to build an entirely new manufacturing company from the ground up with substantial financial backing already in place. Experienced investors described him as the rare leader who could inspire confidence from employees and shareholders at the same time. Industry veterans admired his ability to navigate economic crises without sacrificing integrity. Financial institutions that had once viewed him only as Edward Harrington's trusted executive now approached him directly, expressing confidence in his judgment and offering support for future ventures. Daniel listened respectfully to every proposal without making promises. Wealth had never been the reason he devoted his life to Harrington Manufacturing, and he refused to let disappointment suddenly redefine his values. Every evening he returned home, reviewed handwritten notes from each conversation, and quietly asked himself the same question. Was he searching for another company to lead, or was life presenting him with an entirely different purpose? The answer remained frustratingly out of reach, yet one thing had become increasingly clear. The opportunities before him no longer depended upon Edward's promises. They depended upon the reputation Daniel had earned through his own character. Perhaps the most emotional conversations came not from executives or investors, but from the people who had worked beside him for years. Former factory managers called simply to say that if Daniel ever decided to build something new, they would gladly leave secure positions and join him without hesitation. Engineers who had helped modernize Harrington Manufacturing's production systems offered to volunteer their time during the early stages of any new project. Retired supervisors introduced him to younger professionals eager to work under someone whose leadership they had admired for years through stories shared by their parents. Even skilled tradespeople from facilities across the country quietly reached out, explaining that they missed working in an environment where respect mattered more than hierarchy. Daniel was deeply moved by every conversation because none of these people asked about salaries, job titles, or benefits before offering their support. They talked instead about trust, purpose, teamwork, and the kind of culture they believed had slowly disappeared after Edward's death. Listening to their voices, Daniel realized something extraordinary. People were not following an opportunity. They were following a leader they believed genuinely cared about them. That realization carried a responsibility far greater than accepting any individual job offer. One evening, Daniel drove alone to a quiet hill overlooking the city, where the lights of countless businesses shimmered against the darkening sky. Somewhere among those lights stood the headquarters of Harrington Manufacturing, the company that had shaped 15 years of his life and tested every belief he held about loyalty, trust, and sacrifice. He felt no anger toward the building itself. Instead, he felt gratitude for the lessons it had given him, painful though many of them had been. Then he opened the folder containing the latest proposals from investors, letters from former employees, and invitations from competing manufacturers. Each document represented a different future. He could accept the security of leading another established company. He could partner with experienced investors to build something entirely new. Or he could walk away from the corporate world altogether and leave that chapter of his life behind forever. For the first time since Edward's funeral, The decision belonged entirely to him. No promises, no assumptions, no dependence upon someone else's intentions, only his own judgment. As Daniel looked across the city, he quietly smiled, closed the folder, and whispered words no one else could hear. He had finally reached the moment where the future was his to choose. The only question remaining was whether he would spend the rest of his life rebuilding someone else's legacy or begin creating one that would carry his own name from the very first day. The beginning looked nothing like the empire Daniel Carter had helped build over the previous 15 years. There were no towering headquarters, no polished executive suites, no rows of luxury vehicles filling an enormous parking lot, and no staff of hundreds waiting for morning instructions. Instead, Daniel unlocked the door to a modest office in a renovated brick building on the edge of a small industrial district. The conference room contained a single wooden table purchased secondhand. The reception area held only a few chairs and a coffee machine that occasionally refused to cooperate. The warehouse behind the office echoed with empty space waiting to be filled. To anyone passing by, it looked like the beginning of an ordinary small business with uncertain prospects. But Daniel understood something he had learned long before. Great companies are rarely born from impressive buildings. They begin with people who share the same purpose. Standing quietly inside that nearly empty office, he felt something he had not experienced in a very long time. Every decision made from that moment forward would be built on honesty, transparency, and promises that would exist both in words and on paper. He would never allow another person to dedicate years of loyalty while depending only on trust. The painful lesson that had changed his life would become the foundation upon which every future decision would rest. The first employees arrived one at a time. Some had worked beside Daniel for decades. Others were younger professionals who had heard countless stories about his leadership during the difficult years at Harrington Manufacturing. None of them came because the salaries were extraordinary. In truth, Daniel could not yet offer the kind of financial security available at larger companies. What he offered instead was something many believed had become increasingly difficult to find: respect. Every person who accepted a position received a written employment agreement that clearly explained responsibilities, opportunities for advancement, and the company's commitment to fairness. During their first meeting together, Daniel spoke less about profits than about principles. He told them that every employee deserved honesty, that success should never depend upon hidden conversations behind closed doors, and that no promise would ever be left unwritten simply because trust already existed. The room remained completely silent as people listened, not because they questioned his words, but because they recognized they were hearing promises shaped by painful experience rather than empty ambition. Before the meeting ended, Daniel looked around the room and quietly said, "If we succeed, every person who helps build this company will know exactly where they stand. No uncertainty, no assumptions, no surprises." Those simple words earned more confidence than any expensive advertising campaign ever could. As weeks turned into months, something remarkable began happening. Former colleagues who had initially chosen to remain elsewhere quietly reached out, asking whether Daniel still had room for one more engineer, one more production manager, one more logistics specialist, or one more accountant. Suppliers who remembered his integrity offered flexible payment terms during the company's early stages because they trusted his character more than financial projections. Customers who had worked with Daniel for years began transferring smaller contracts, explaining that they preferred doing business with people whose word had consistently matched their actions. Investors who had once competed for the opportunity to hire him instead became long-term partners, impressed by the disciplined culture developing inside the modest organization. Every success seemed connected to relationships Daniel had built long before opening the company's doors. It became increasingly clear that the greatest asset following him into this new chapter was never machinery, property, or capital. It was trust accumulated over 15 years of treating people with fairness and respect. The new company remained small by industry standards, but its reputation spread much faster than anyone expected because satisfied employees and loyal customers became its strongest ambassadors. Growth arrived steadily rather than dramatically. The warehouse that once echoed with empty space slowly filled with equipment. The handful of desks expanded into departments led by people Daniel had personally mentored years earlier. New contracts created additional jobs, allowing families throughout the community to build stable futures together. Local newspapers began publishing stories about the remarkable culture developing inside the young company, highlighting its unusually low employee turnover and the loyalty shown by both customers and staff. Industry analysts noted that while competitors invested heavily in marketing campaigns, Daniel's business continued attracting clients primarily through recommendations from people who trusted its leadership. Every milestone carried quiet significance because it represented more than financial success. It represented proof that values could still compete in a world often dominated by short-term thinking. One evening, after everyone else had gone home, Daniel walked slowly through the busy production floor and smiled as he watched machines running, employees laughing together, and supervisors helping new team members learn their craft. He remembered the empty warehouse he had first unlocked not so long ago and realized that the company surrounding him had not been built by money alone. It had been built by people who believed character deserved another chance. Looking around, Daniel understood that although someone had once removed his name from every official document that mattered, they had unknowingly given him something far greater. They had given him the opportunity to build a legacy that would bear his own name from the very beginning, one founded not on promises waiting to be fulfilled, but on promises already being kept every single day. Months after the courtroom testimony had ended, and long after the headlines began fading from public attention, Emily returned once more to her father's private study. She was not searching for evidence anymore. She had already accepted that some questions might never receive complete legal answers. Instead, she simply wanted to preserve the memories of the man she had loved all her life. As she carefully organized old photographs, family letters, and boxes of personal belongings, she noticed a small archival case tucked behind several leather-bound albums on the highest shelf. It had escaped attention during every previous search because it blended almost perfectly with the surrounding books. Inside the case rested several labeled storage drives and an envelope in Edward Harrington's unmistakable handwriting. On the front, he had written only a few simple words: "For my family, if I am no longer here to explain." Emily's heart began beating faster. She carried the case downstairs, called Daniel, and asked him to come over. Less than an hour later, they sat together in the same study where Edward had once spent countless evenings planning the future of the company they had built side by side. Neither of them spoke as the old recording slowly appeared on the screen. Edward looked older than either of them remembered, yet his eyes still carried the calm determination that had inspired so many people throughout his life. He smiled gently before beginning to speak, pausing occasionally as though choosing every word with great care. "If you're watching this," he said softly, "then I was not given the chance to finish certain conversations that should never have been left unfinished." He spoke first about his gratitude for the employees who had helped transform Harrington Manufacturing into a company respected across America. He thanked his family for standing beside him through decades of sacrifice, uncertainty, and success. Then his expression became more personal. Looking directly into the camera, he said, "There is one person I hope never doubts what he has meant to me." Daniel felt his chest tighten as Edward slowly continued. "Daniel, from the day you walked into my life, I watched you choose responsibility over comfort, service over recognition, and integrity over personal gain. You earned my trust long before you realized it. You became the son I never had, not because you married my daughter, but because you lived every value I hoped would outlast me." Edward paused for a long moment before continuing, his voice carrying a sadness neither Daniel nor Emily had ever heard before. "For years, I told everyone that one day this company would be yours because I believed with all my heart that you were the right person to protect it. I believed there would always be enough time to complete every remaining detail. I allowed meetings to be postponed. I accepted reassurances that certain legal matters could wait until my schedule became less demanding. I placed confidence in processes I should have personally confirmed, instead of assuming they would be completed exactly as intended." He lowered his eyes briefly before looking back into the camera. "Ow, that was my mistake. I trusted others to finish work that was my responsibility alone. Intentions are not the same as completed actions. I learned that lesson too late." Tears quietly filled Emily's eyes as Daniel remained motionless, listening to the words he had waited so many months to hear. They did not change the legal record. They did not rewrite history. But they answered the question that had haunted him since the funeral. Edward had never stopped believing in him. He had simply believed tomorrow would always give him another opportunity to finish what should have been completed that very day. The recording ended not with instructions about wealth or ownership, but with a reflection that seemed to capture everything Edward had learned over a lifetime. "If my greatest failure was leaving important work unfinished," he said, "then let my greatest lesson be this. Never ask the people you love to depend only on your promises. Protect them with your actions while you still can." The screen slowly faded to black, leaving the study completely silent. Daniel looked around the room where so many decisions had once been made and finally understood the true tragedy. It had never been a story about a man secretly denied his inheritance by a single dramatic act. It was the story of how trust, good intentions, and delayed decisions can combine to create consequences no one ever wanted. Edward's love had been genuine. His confidence in Daniel had been real. His vision for the future had existed long before anyone else recognized it. But because he believed there would always be more time, the legal certainty that should have protected everyone was never fully secured. In that quiet realization, the final mystery came to an end. The audience could finally see the heartbreaking truth. Sometimes the greatest losses are not caused by the absence of love, but by the dangerous assumption that tomorrow is guaranteed. Several years passed, and time accomplished what courtrooms, arguments, and headlines never could. Daniel Carter never spoke publicly about revenge, nor did he spend his future trying to destroy the company that had once defined his life. Instead, he devoted every ounce of his energy to building something worthy of the people who had chosen to believe in him. What began inside a modest office with a handful of employees gradually became one of the fastest-growing manufacturing companies in the country. New facilities opened across several states. Long-term partnerships replaced short-term contracts. Communities welcomed new jobs, apprenticeships, and investment. Business schools quietly began studying Daniel's leadership philosophy, pointing to his emphasis on transparency, accountability, and putting commitments in writing. Industry magazines described his organization as a model of modern American manufacturing, not because it generated extraordinary profits alone, but because employees remained fiercely loyal to a culture built on trust. Every major decision reflected the painful lesson that had changed Daniel's life forever. Every agreement was documented, every promise was recorded, every employee understood exactly where they stood. Daniel often reminded his leadership team that trust and documentation were never enemies. They were partners. When both existed together, people could dedicate their lives to a shared purpose without fear that history would someday forget their contributions. Across town, the story unfolded very differently for Harrington Manufacturing. The company Edward Harrington had spent his lifetime building struggled to recover from years of declining morale, constant leadership changes, and the gradual loss of the people who had once formed its foundation. Longtime customers continued moving their business elsewhere. Experienced managers accepted opportunities with competitors or retired earlier than planned. The company's proud reputation slowly faded from industry conversations, replaced by stories of missed opportunities and internal conflict. Eventually, after several difficult years, Harrington Manufacturing ceased operating as an independent family business. Its remaining assets were sold, its factories absorbed into larger organizations, and the famous Harrington name quietly disappeared from the manufacturing landscape it had once helped shape. The buildings remained, but the identity Edward had worked so hard to create became little more than a chapter in business history. Ironically, the empire that had fought so fiercely to protect ownership ultimately lost the one thing Daniel had spent 15 years preserving every single day: the confidence of its people. In the end, it was never machinery, patents, or financial statements that determined the company's future. It was the loss of trust that no balance sheet had ever measured. One quiet autumn afternoon, long after the legal battles had faded into memory, Daniel drove alone to the peaceful cemetery where Edward Harrington had been laid to rest. The air carried the crisp stillness of late October, and golden leaves drifted gently across the pathways between rows of weathered headstones. There were no reporters waiting nearby. No executives, no attorneys, no courtroom, no audience. Just a man standing before the grave of someone who had forever changed the direction of his life. Daniel held a single white flower in his hand. He knelt slowly, brushed away a few fallen leaves that had settled against the engraved stone, and placed the flower carefully at its base. For several long moments, he said nothing at all. He simply stood there, remembering late-night strategy sessions, factory visits, quiet conversations, difficult decisions, shared victories, and the unwavering belief Edward had shown in him from the very beginning. Despite everything that had happened, Daniel found that resentment no longer occupied his heart. Time had replaced anger with understanding, and understanding had made room for forgiveness. But forgiveness did not erase truth. Some lessons remain painful precisely because they are real. Daniel looked at the headstone one final time before speaking so softly that only the quiet breeze could carry his words. You gave me everything except the one thing that mattered. Proof. He allowed the sentence to settle into the silence, neither accusing nor condemning the man who rested beneath the stone. It was simply the truth. Edward had given him opportunity, confidence, wisdom, responsibility, and the chance to discover the leader he was capable of becoming. Yet the one promise left unfinished had changed countless lives forever. Daniel nodded gently, turned away from the grave, and began walking back toward the cemetery gate without looking behind him. The camera lingers as the white flower rests quietly against the stone beneath the fading afternoon light. The wind moves softly through the trees. The screen slowly fades to black. And before the silence completely settles, one final question remains for every viewer to carry home. How many lives have been changed because someone believed there would always be more time to finish what mattered most? Before we end, let us know your thoughts in the comments. If this story moved you, share where you're watching from, and don't forget to subscribe so you never miss our next unforgettable story. As this story comes to an end, the courtroom arguments, business records, and family disputes begin to fade into the background. What remains are the questions that reach far beyond one company or one family. Daniel Carter's journey was never simply about losing an inheritance. It was about what happens when loyalty is offered without protection, when years of sacrifice are built upon trust alone, and when promises are never transformed into something that can survive the person who made them. Loyalty is one of the greatest qualities a person can possess, but loyalty should never require someone to surrender wisdom. Trust is essential in every meaningful relationship, yet trust and written agreements are not opposites. They exist to protect one another. The strongest handshake in the world still deserves a signature, not because love or respect is absent, but because life is uncertain. Memories fade, circumstances change, people leave us. Documents remain. That is not a sign of doubt. It is an act of responsibility toward the people who place their future in our hands. The story also reminds us that family and business do not always follow the same rules. Love can unite a family around a dinner table, but business demands clarity, accountability, and decisions that leave no room for misunderstanding. Many families begin companies with shared dreams, believing that affection alone will prevent conflict. Yet history has shown, time and again, that even the closest relationships can fracture when expectations are never clearly defined. Difficult conversations postponed today often become painful conflicts tomorrow. Good intentions may comfort the heart, but they cannot resolve unanswered legal questions after someone is gone. Edward Harrington genuinely admired Daniel. He believed in him, trusted him, and envisioned him as the future of the company. Yet belief without completed action left behind confusion instead of certainty. His greatest mistake was not failing to love Daniel. His greatest mistake was believing there would always be another opportunity to finish what mattered most. Life rarely guarantees that opportunity. Perhaps the most powerful lesson is the difference between ownership and legacy. Ownership can be transferred with a signature. It can be bought, sold, inherited, or lost. Legacy is entirely different. Legacy is built through character, humility, consistency, and the lives we quietly influence every day. Daniel eventually understood that although his name never appeared on the documents he expected, it had already been written somewhere far more meaningful in the respect of thousands of employees, in the gratitude of families whose lives he changed, and in the example he set for every leader who came after him. The company he built afterward succeeded not because he chased revenge, but because he carried those lessons into a new beginning. In the end, the greatest victories are often not about reclaiming what was lost. They are about becoming the kind of person no disappointment can ever diminish. So now the question belongs to you. If you had spent 15 years building someone else's dream, only to discover your name was never written down, would you fight to reclaim it? Or would you walk away and build something entirely your own? Before you go, tell us in the comments, do you think Edward truly intended to leave the company to Daniel? Or was Daniel deceived from the very beginning? Your perspective could completely change how others see this story. And if you enjoy powerful stories about loyalty, family, and unexpected twists, Subscribe to Plot Frame Tales